An innocent ride home takes a gruesome turn.
It was a crime of absolutely no logical reason.
A family's desperate search for their missing brother turns up nothing until a psychic 2,000 miles away tells them where to look.
This is where you have to go, and this is where you find your brother's vehicle.
She had a lot of details. She didn't get them from us. She didn't get them from the media.
But her visions make legal history.
There was total and complete silence during her testimony. Never heard anything like that before.
River Ridge, Louisiana, a small town on the banks of the Mississippi River, a suburb of New Orleans.
Pretty much people in River Ridge know each other pretty well. It's just sort of a small slice of American pie type of community. You wouldn't expect a person, particularly a hard-working carpenter, to suddenly disappear.
But in June of 1987, that's exactly what did happen. 27-year-old Andre Dagel vanished without a trace.
My mother called me Friday morning and told me that Andre was, missing and she hadn't heard from him. We're a close-knit family and very tight, and Andre wouldn't leave the pets without food or water, for one. And the other thing is, generally somebody would hear from him on a daily basis.
Andre's older brother Chris contacts the police immediately, but they're not convinced there's a problem and are slow to act.
The fact that he was a 27-year-old grown man, the police were like, what makes you think he's missing?
But the family believes something is very wrong and begin their own investigation, retracing his last steps.
Are you sure you haven't seen this guy?
The night he disappeared, he and Nick Shelley went to have dinner together, and then they went out to Mitchell's to shoot some pool.
Andre and his best friend Nick were playing pool for beers. Loser buys. Andre lost the first game, and at the bar he met a young woman who called herself Thelma.
And they chit-chatted, just making small talk, just both being patrons in there. When I talked to Nick about it, he tells me that he felt that she seemed to kind of hide her face, so he really didn't get a good look at her. It was a bit odd, but, that's just something you don't think about. I mean, these are the things you think about later, after they played a few games and had a few drinks. They were getting ready to leave, and that's when Thelma asked Andre for a ride home.
Andre agreed, and Nick Shelley went home separately in his own car. It's the last time he will ever see his best friend. 4 days pass and nothing. 2,000 miles away in California, Andre's sister Elise is desperate to help. A friend suggests she visit a psychic.
When she came to see me, Elise told me she had a brother that was missing. I just asked her if she brought a picture of her brother and a map with her, and she said yes.
Rosemary Kerr lives in Escondido, California. She claims she has a special talent for finding missing people. She'll need it. She's never been to Louisiana and never met the Dagel family.
When I go to the picture, I don't need to look at it because the minute I put my fingers on it, I get vibrations. So my fingers, say it's like somebody reading Braille. I'm making my connection. Everybody else is out.
The connection Rosemary makes is immediate and profound.
As I'm touching the picture, I'm seeing all these things behind my eyes. I was telling Elise how I see her brother in his dark vehicle, and she denied this. She says, no, he drives the little white car. But I needed to go with the dark car because this is what Andre was showing me.
Elise is not aware that her brother has recently bought a new vehicle, a black Ford pickup.
When Elise said, oh no, he has got a white car, I thank God that I had myself programmed that I do not listen to anybody else but only what comes in, whether it's right or wrong. I cannot change that.
Now Rosemary focuses on the map of Louisiana.
And as I run my finger along the maps, my fingers tell me where to stop. It's a vibration in my fingers. And I stopped and I opened my eyes and I asked Elise, I says, Elise, do you know this place? Do you recognize this? Right in here. And she says, this is Slidell. She says, I know it. I says, if you know this place, you have to do it now, do it quick. This is where you have to go, and this is where you find your brother's vehicle and find out where he is.
Slidell is 30 miles from the Dagel home in River Ridge. Chris and the family had just arrived back after a full day of searching. They were not prepared for what would happen next.
We were all in the kitchen with the maps laid out, trying to figure out, okay, where are we going to go tomorrow? What are we going to do? That's when the phone rang, and my mother got the call from Elise.
I just had a reading with the psychic here. And
You know, she says, the lady says to go to Slidell. Well, man, when she said that, everybody in the room just got shook. You know, you could feel goosebumps, and it was like the spirit had walked through there and touched you on the shoulder just to let you know, this is real. You got to go.
Within minutes, Chris and his family are racing towards Slidell, guided, they believe, by the spirit of their missing brother.
They went out in their vehicles to look for Andre. I told them to talk to Andre. And Elise said, why? I says, I want the open connection.
So we did, we knew he was frightened. We didn't know if he was alive or not. And we just wanted to reach out to him, and let him know that, his family was there. So.
Then, incredibly, there on the interstate, Chris spots Andre's truck ahead. The black pickup is heading towards Slidell, exactly where the psychic said it would be.
I actually kind of passed the truck up at first. I didn't even expect to see it, really, but drove up. Hey, was that it? Sure enough, that was it. Of course, we didn't recognize who was in the, driver's seat and who was in there driving it.
How could a psychic 2,000 miles away know where to find Andre's truck? But where is Andre? And who's at the wheel? In River Ridge, Louisiana, the mysterious disappearance of 27-year-old Andre Dagel has his family searching everywhere. 5 days pass without any success. Then, a California psychic 2,000 miles away points them in the right direction.
This is where you have to go, and this is where you find your brother's vehicle.
And sure enough, going down the interstate on our way to Slidell, and there was the truck. Of course, we didn't recognize who was in the driver's seat and who was in there driving it. So we decided at that point that we'd just kind of stick with them and see where they led us.
Chris tails the truck for nearly 30 minutes. Suddenly, the truck veers off the interstate and leads them down a deserted side road.
And there's no lights. It was pitch black out there. So I'm kind of sitting back about, 50, 60 feet from where they were. Didn't want to get too close, but we wanted to stay close enough that if they left or did anything, we were there. They turned the truck around, facing back towards us, and then they killed the motor and turned the lights on. Well, that was very spooky, because now we knew that they knew we were following them. They drove by real slow and just kind of checked us out and looked at us, And as they got by, they took off. We just drove down that road not seconds before, and it was empty. Here we are 30 seconds later, we go down the same road, and who do we see? A police car.
As luck would have it, they ran across the only patrol car in the Pearl River area parked alongside the road that they were on.
We're all yelling, get that truck. Man, this is my brother. That's his truck. He's missing. You got to stop these guys. And that's when we got into a high-speed chase.
When police forced the truck to pull over, they believe they're investigating a stolen vehicle. As police search the truck, they find both guns and ammunition.
We didn't care about them. We didn't care about the truck. We didn't care about anything. We just wanted to know where was Andre. So I kind of walked up a little bit closer, and I asked him, I said, where's my brother? What'd you do with my brother? Where is he? Well, of course, they wouldn't answer.
But where is Andre? 2,000 miles away in California, psychic Rosemary Kerr believes she knows the answer.
When I felt myself holding my head and basically speaking louder and louder and louder because I could feel the pain, and I started yelling to Elise, "My head is killing me." And as I felt that, I went into, I want to say, a different mode, because I knew that I was looking for somebody that had already left the earth plane.
But Rosemary withholds this piece of information.
Elise did not ask if her brother was alive or dead. I am just the conductor of the words. I'm just a channel. But in order for it to be done the proper way, it has to go through the proper channels. It's for the authorities.
And the authorities were working fast. They identified the two men as 24-year-old Charles Gervais of New Orleans and 21-year-old Michael Phillips of Kenner. The two are brought in on weapons and stolen vehicle charges.
These two were not new to crime.
Captain James Gallagher of the Kenner Police Department is one of the officers in charge of the investigation.
The chief and his officers began interviewing Charles Gervais and Michael Phillips as to how they came in possession of the truck.
At first, Gervais isn't talking, but under questioning, his friend Michael Phillips eventually cracks. He describes a senseless, brutal murder, a murder committed, he says, by Gervais.
Once Charles realized that Mike was talking to the authorities, he demanded to speak to him, wanted to get the record straight. They talked about how they had Andre brought back to their apartment with Thelma. At some point they retrieve a claw hammer out of Andre's truck. Then they take turns beating him with his own claw hammer.
The killer's motive was more extraordinary than even the police could have imagined.
The question was asked, why would you kill Andre? What was the purpose behind it? And Gervais tells me this story about hearing about a prostitution ring somewhere in Texas. And him and Mike decide, well, we don't want to work for a living. We'll just go to Texas and we'll kill whoever's running this operation and we'll take it over, and the women will work for us. So they decide, well, if we're going to do this, we have to know before we get involved that we can actually take a life. So they come up with the scheme of sending Thelma out to bars and to look for someone, anyone, whoever she brings home, that person's going to die. And unfortunately, in this case, the person she brought home was Andre.
Andre Dagel was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, picked at random and killed as a dress rehearsal for a gangland hit, his body dumped in a swamp.
Gervais showed no remorse. He wasn't sorry that he did anything. Didn't bother him, that he had destroyed a family, and taken away someone's son.
Once police recover the body, both men are charged with first-degree murder, and a warrant goes out for their accomplice, 21-year-old Thelma Horn of Kenner. Now police have to inform the family of their worst fear. Their youngest son, Andre, is dead.
I never dreamed he would be dead. We needed to believe he was alive. We needed to believe that we could find him. We needed to believe that, that we could help him. And so we really thought we were. We thought we were going to find him alive. I thought we were, but it didn't work out that way. But at least we were able to find him and find the people who committed the crime.
But this case is far from over. Even with a confession, both men could still plead not guilty in court.
If the defendant doesn't take the stand and doesn't testify on his own behalf, you cannot use his statement against him.
In Louisiana, a not guilty plea can lead to the death penalty. Gervais sees the writing on the wall, admits his guilt, and is sentenced to life in prison. But Thelma Horn and Michael Phillips roll the dice. They plead not guilty and opt for a trial.
I think Michael was more concerned about consequences. He knew that we already pretty much had the whole story of what occurred, but he wanted to try and downplay his participation.
Gallagher needs as much evidence as possible. When he learns from Chris that it was a psychic's vision that led them to Andre's truck and exposed their killers, he reluctantly gives her a call.
You know, I deal with facts. I deal with things, you know, tangible things. And up until that point, I was still trying to figure out, you know, what the angle was. How did this happen?
Hello?
It was a phone call that would change a cop and make courtroom history.
There was total and complete silence during her testimony. Never heard anything like that before.
In Louisiana, the disappearance of a 27-year-old carpenter, Andre Dagel, has ended in murder. A California psychic has helped the Dagel family and police track down the killers. Now the police must work with a psychic to make sure the suspects are locked away forever.
Well, I learned that the way these people were actually caught was a tip from a psychic, a lady named Rosemary Kerr, who lived in California.
When Captain Gallagher contacts Rosemary, she recounts the details of her reading with Andre's sister.
So I come into Andre's vibration, getting more and more headaches coming in very, very strongly.
Well, she was talking about, I'm feeling pain to my head right now as I'm handling his photograph. I already knew from the investigation that Andre had been beaten with a hammer.
The autopsy revealed that Andre had been struck 10 times in the head.
She talks about where the body's at and where Andre's at.
I could see and also feel a freeway or a roadway that was to my right and high above me. I knew there was a railroad track to the other side. I knew there was marshes there. The number 7 kept coming in and coming in very strongly.
When Gallagher travels back to the location where Dagel's body was found, he's amazed at the psychic's accuracy.
We got off on exit number 7 right down the road to get here. As Rose told me during my interview with her, she described a long bridge, and what we have behind me here is Interstate 55, which runs for about 24 miles, elevated through the swamp. She indicated there'd be water all around Andre. Well, here we are, next to the swamp here. She had a lot of details that no other way she could have gotten them. She didn't get them from us. She didn't get them from the media, and it just, I was amazed, but I became a believer after talking with her.
He was kind of flabbergasted because he had never worked with a psychic before, and he wanted to know how I knew all these things. But what was so lovely about him, he's accepted me for who I was. He questioned me very, very thoroughly, wanting to know how I work and how I know it. And though I could feel skepticism at first, he, as we talked and talked and talked, he accepted the fact because he was able to verify the information that was given to him.
You have to be a believer because there's no other, there's no explanation for what she gave him other than that she has a gift.
But could a psychic's visions hold up in a court of law? W.J. LeBlanc, a Louisiana district attorney, thinks Rosemary's testimony is key.
When I first took the case, I really didn't have an expectation that the psychic would testify. I read through the file. It was almost too fantastic to believe in terms of what role she played in the apprehension of these individuals. But I did want to meet her to verify that that is exactly what happened, which was what was in the report. When I met with her and we discussed exactly what she did and how it did, I realized how compelling it was and that the jury really needed to hear it. The jury needed to hear why the family left River Ridge and drove to Slidell and how they just happened to run across their missing family member's truck with the killers in it. From an evidentiary standpoint, there were some people in the office who were skittish about using a psychic during a trial. My position was that she was a fact witness, and based upon what she saw, someone else relayed that information to someone else, which led to the arrest of the defendants.
The brutal and bizarre murder of Andre Dagel makes front-page news, but what really grabs headlines is the psychic.
This case, in many ways, was sort of a bellwether case in establishing psychic involvement as an important forensic tool in conducting investigations in cases that were very difficult.
Richard Boyd was the court reporter at the Dagel trial.
In my 10 years of covering courts, it was the most amazing, astounding chain of circumstances that I ever ran across.
It would be the first time in U.S. legal history that a psychic would take the stand and describe how her visions helped to solve a murder.
Well, I had never been on a witness stand, and I would be the first in doing this work as a psychic testifying, but I didn't feel any qualms, no pressures or anything. It felt like it was the normal thing to do.
February 2nd, 1988, 1 year after the murder, the state presents its case to a packed courtroom. W.J. LeBlanc, the DA, outlines for the jury the gruesome details of Andre Dagel's last hours. On the night of June 9th, 1987, Andre Dagel was playing pool with his best friend, Nick Shelley. At the bar, he meets a young woman, Thelma Horn. She later asks for a lift home. Inside the apartment, Charles Gervais and Michael Phillips ambush Andre, attacking him with a hammer taken from a toolbox in his truck. Their botched murder finally ended when the two men used a vacuum cord to strangle Andre to death. They wrapped his body in a curtain and hid him in the back of a couch. The following night, they dumped his body in a swampy marsh below the causeway. The evidence against the two men is compelling. Now the DA calls the psychic to the witness stand to help seal the prosecution case.
You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. I mean, people were just enraptured by it, just totally focused on her.
Thank you. There's an old
Rosemary Kerr tells the jury how her vision led the Dagels to Andre's missing truck.
You know, the emotion, it was just a chill went through the room.
At the close of the state's case, faced with the evidence, Michael Phillips changes his plea to guilty.
He was headed straight for the electric chair. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury was hanging on every word of every witness, from Rosemary to Chris Dagel to Nick Shelley. Even someone as slow as Michael Phillips, I think, could sense that this was heading to the direction where he was not going to like.
Without that information provided by Rose, which eventually led to the arrest, he would have been possibly another John Doe, unsolved homicide.
In a separate trial, the killer's accomplice Thelma Horn is found guilty of second-degree murder. With the help of the psychic's testimony, all three are serving life sentences.
That was the first time that a psychic had ever testified in a criminal trial. And to my knowledge, I don't think that one ever has testified since. It was a fairly unique set of circumstances that led to her testifying in the trial. Because Andre Dagel was a very special young man, and there was just this feel about the trial that everything was coming together to see that Andre's killers were brought to justice. And I think that Rosemary's testimony was a big part of that.
I feel that this whole scenario wasn't in our hands, but in a higher power, and we all just did our job. And I have to give credit to the departments that work with people like me and realize if we can give them just one little piece of the puzzle and that could help them, that's what we're about.
The Dagel family was devastated. To this day, is still devastated to a large extent by this senseless crime. Andre Dagel, a promising young man who was hardworking, lost his life for absolutely no reason, for no discernible, clear reason.
Andre was a great brother. You know, if you ever needed his help, he was there for you. You know, he was just a wonderful guy, thoughtful, kind, gentle. You know, after the funeral, people would just walk up to me, guys who went to high school with, I mean, 100 guys came to me and said, Andre was my best friend. I'm going to miss Andre. He was my best friend. I mean, he was everybody's best friend, I mean, that's quite impressive, to hear that from people. His life was cut so short, I don't know if he had time to even figure that out. Here's Rosemary, a little lady living out there in California, 2,000 miles away from us. Think that someone has that ability, to make contact and into the spirit world like that and able to help, but she's connected.
A business trip turns deadly when a state auditor is found at the bottom of a ravine.
Somebody was mad, and they took it out on this victim before they actually executed him.
We all knew that foul play had occurred.
There's a killer on the loose, and police have little to go on.
Well, we didn't have any blood evidence. We didn't have any fingerprints.
Until a psychic breathes new life into the case.
I'm seeing the murderer now. So dangerous.
But are her visions enough to catch a killer in a lie?
We knew that we were only going to get one chance to speak with Eugene Moore.
And will a psychic's chilling premonition come true?
You won't take him alive.
Shelby, Montana. Population 3,300. Part of the Montana Highline, stretching 650 miles from North Dakota to the Idaho border. It's a crossroads where Highway 2 and Interstate 13 meet, a transient place. The last stop for truckers and trains heading to Canada. On the morning of November 13th, 1989, 40-year-old state tax auditor Walter Sullivan left his home in Great Falls and made the 45-mile drive to Shelby for a business trip. He never returned.
Walt was one of the field representatives who worked out in the field, working with employers, collecting taxes, making sure that employers were reporting properly.
Sue Moore worked alongside Walter for 13 years. He was a dedicated employee who had worked for the state for more than 18 years. When Walter fails to show up for 2 of his appointments, his co-workers begin to worry.
I called the governor's office. I mean, I will never forget this. Whoever his chief of staff or whoever the person was that I talked to said, he'll show up when he sobers up. And I almost dropped the phone. I said, you got this all wrong.
Their indifference angered Sue. She knew Walt to be a family man. He'd married his high school sweetheart and was the proud father of 2 boys. It would take 24 hours for Shelby police to issue a missing persons report for 40-year-old Walter Sullivan.
We began backtracking every place that Mr. Sullivan had went.
Dave Robbins was the Shelby County investigator on the case. He learns that Walter had 3 appointments the day he went missing and only made it to 1.
We're suspecting that the last person that talked to him was Gene Moore.
Eugene Moore owned and operated a truck stop in Shelby. When police contact him, he says he did meet with Walter and that he left the same day. A week goes by, and Walter's disappearance is big news. The whole town is talking.
We start hearing that he was here, he was there, he's turning up all over town at certain times of the day. And
I knew Walt really, really well, and the idea that he was off gallivanting and sporting about somewhere was just nuts. I mean, just nuts, and of course, a horrible, horrible insult to his family.
We were developing information because we were hoping beyond hope that this man would turn up safe and alive someplace.
November 22nd, 9 days after Walter went missing. His mangled car is spotted 250 feet down in a ravine.
We picked our way down away from it so we wouldn't disturb anything, but as you peered over the top, you could see a body laying down there, so we knew we had a crime scene.
There lay the lifeless body of Walter Sullivan.
The car was pretty banged up because it went off this cliff and rolled down there, so a lot of what we did in video footage was to collect the evidence and document where it was.
It was our worst fear was realized, and we were devastated. All I remember doing is crying and wanting to know that something was being done.
An autopsy would reveal that Walter Sullivan's death was no accident.
The victim had been beaten severely about the head and the face, and that he had been shot at close quarters in the back of the head. Somebody was mad, and they took it out on this victim before they actually executed him.
Who killed Walter Sullivan and why? With no fingerprints and few clues, police revisit the last man who saw him alive. Eugene Moore gives them a more detailed account.
He said around 8 o'clock that Mr. Sullivan left to go to his place to do the audit because that's where he keeps the records. He said that Mr. Sullivan did not follow him directly to his place, arrived a few minutes later, and at that point had another gentleman with him who he described as a Native American with long black hair. He stated that Mr. Sullivan only wanted a couple years state tax returns and some checks from his ledger book, and that's all.
When police do a background check on Moore, they learn he is an ex-Marine and has been trained in combat warfare. They also learn he threatened other auditors in the past.
We all knew that foul play had occurred. I mean, we knew it. Walt had said earlier at a meeting with some of the other field reps that he was going to go to Shelby and see a guy who he was concerned about, who he knew was going to be difficult to work with.
Eugene Moore's business was flagged when the state learned he hadn't filed a tax return in more than 15 years.
We're talking about somebody who truly subscribed to that whole tax protester notion. Walt often had a history of bringing employers like that around so that they would start out being very anti-government. And when Walt got done with them, he made them see why he was doing what he was doing, and which is really what the very best of our field reps were able and still are able to do is promote that.
There was a gentleman that worked at Mr. Moore's truck stop, and this guy had been laid off, and so he went to file for unemployment, and there was no files, there was nothing on him, so Mr. Moore had turned in nothing to the state. That's what precipitated this audit that was coming from Walter Sullivan.
Police obtain a warrant to search Moore's business and home, but find no hard evidence.
I felt I had good evidence in regard, though it was circumstantial. We had no physical evidence to tie our suspect to this crime other than the fact of his story and what he had said to us.
Another snag, Moore's wife, Tammy, provides an alibi for her husband, claiming he was at home that entire evening.
It was during that time or after that interview, that we called him back to try to do another one, and we were contacted by a lawyer out of Cutbank who said, I now represent Mr. Gene Moore, and he's not going to talk to you gentlemen again, so leave him alone. And so we backed off for a while.
With nothing else to go on, the case is stalled and sits on the shelf for 6 years. Family and friends of Walter Sullivan couldn't let it go. A state worker murdered on the job, and no one was doing anything about it.
The worst part of the aftermath of Walt's tragedy was knowing that this employer was wandering around literally on the loose, and apparently, as we found out later, had changed businesses, had moved around up there, none of which I knew about. It was infuriating. I was mad to tears.
Finally, Sue's anger turned to action. She writes a letter to the local paper demanding justice for Walter Sullivan. That single letter hit a nerve. News media across the state picked up the story.
The pressure actually came from outside. It came from news media, Great Falls. We were constantly being called, and I think people were upset that a crime like this would happen in this community.
It pressured Montana's Attorney General to assign Joe Uribe, an agent from the Department of Justice, to solve Walter Sullivan's murder once and for all.
We had a meeting between all the officers that were involved in the early investigation and myself.
Joe, right off the bat, he saw the difficulties with the case itself. He knew everything we had. He saw the evidence. He saw the statements. So he knew what we were up against.
After reviewing the case, I felt that there were some things we could do to help get the case going again.
That something different was a psychic.
And I got home, and I turned on the TV. I was pretty tired, but I was amped up after reading the case file. So I turned on the television, and there was a program about psychics on there. After watching her on 3 different cases that she worked on, I felt that maybe she could be some help to us.
A psychic encounter was about to ignite a 6-year cold case, and her visions would stun police.
This was revenge.
In northern Montana, a state auditor is found dead at the bottom of a ravine. He'd been beaten and shot in the head. Police have a suspect, but no hard evidence. The case stalls. 6 years go by, and family and friends demand answers. Who killed Walter Sullivan? Feeling the heat, the state assigns a new investigator to the case. Joe Uribe knows he has to solve this murder no matter what it takes, even if it means traveling more than 2,000 miles to ask a psychic for help.
We decided to fly down to Florida because we had some evidence, and she wanted us to mail the evidence to her, and we didn't want to do that. I was still pretty skeptical. I'd never worked with a psychic before, nor had I ever dreamed of working with a psychic.
I was very skeptical, and honestly, I thought it was just a waste of time.
But after we talked about it a while, we thought, since the case was stalled, what harm could it do?
Noreen Renier is a psychometrist who specializes in missing persons and homicide cases.
Psychometry is touching an object and getting impressions in your head and your mind about the object. And we are energy, and a residue of it is left behind in an object. In very passionate crimes of hate or love, it seems like it leaves more energy than just a missing person walking in the woods and being lost. So homicide is easier for me because the energies are much more powerful. Although violent, they're easier for me to pick up.
Investigators use a video camera to document the session.
Give me the first name of the victim, and then what I'm going to do is just very briefly describe the victim, just enough so you know I'm in tune to it.
In our case, we brought several pieces of clothing, and we even brought the bullet that was in the victim's head.
I remember touching the items, the clothing, and I got a picture of the victim. Okay, I feel facial hair.
She told us that she could see the victim and that he had facial hair. Walter Sullivan had a beard. She told us that he was short, stocky, physique, short-necked. Basically described Walter to the T.
Without a word from the investigators, Noreen has no idea whether she has locked on to their victim, Walter Sullivan.
I'm sure that they thought it was a more scientific process if they didn't react, but somehow I needed that little bit of feedback, but I kept going without any feedback.
We told her nothing about the case, and some of the things she said was just incredible.
I see a blue metal building. I see something like an antenna, like 3 going up, train tracks going close by. There was railroad tracks very close to the blue shed.
Remarkably, Noreen is describing the home of their prime suspect, Eugene Moore.
The physical features that Noreen described, such as a blue metal building, there was a blue metal building on the property. She said there was a railroad track close by. Well, just right across the road from him was a railroad track. And it was strikingly accurate.
At one point, a name just sort of popped in my head, the name Clark. C-L-A-I-R. I just feel that sort of name coming in. Clark. And they sort of looked at each other but said nothing.
Came out kind of spontaneously that she said this word Clark, and incidentally, the body and the car were found on the Clark Ranch about 9 miles southwest of town. We were just amazed. We couldn't believe it. In fact, the hair was standing on the back of my neck a time or two.
And now she gives them a piece of information they didn't know.
The moment she touched the bullet, she had a vision of an attack on Walter Sullivan.
And all of a sudden I was ambushed. Oh, I'm hurting. They're hitting me on the head.
We knew that Walter had been beaten, but we didn't know how many people were involved with it or what the circumstances were.
This was planned. They're torturing him. This was about revenge. And then all of a sudden, I had this excruciating pain in the back of my head.
Something went in her head there, or some pain in her head, and that's exactly where Walter was shot. We had developed information about these two other suspects, but they in fact had been eliminated from being in the area. But Noreen was able to put together for us that they were part of the ambush that occurred out at this Blue Metal building. But she basically laid out the scenario of what we believe is the actual fact of what happened with Walter Sullivan.
But investigators were about to be amazed even more.
Oh my God, it's so dangerous. You won't take him alive. I saw the face in my head, one eye at a time, each feature, the artist put it together, eyebrows more close to the eyes. So we had two faces for them. One is a male and one was a female.
She provided information to her artist, which very accurately depicted our main suspect and his wife.
They again looked at each other, thanked me, packed up their stuff, and left. Again, no feedback on how well I did or how badly I did. No grades were given.
What Noreen didn't know was that her visions gave police new reason to go back to their prime suspect, Eugene Moore.
For me, it brought all of the elements together, and I knew at that point that we had the right man. We'd done intensive homework. We went back step by step through his statement, and we reviewed everything he told us, and we went out to look to see if this is true or not true.
Uribe visits Moore at his truck stop and tells him he is with the Attorney General's office. He says he's there to close the Walter Sullivan case once and for all and wants to hear Moore's side of the story.
He opened up just like a flower and said, well, absolutely. I've been waiting to talk to somebody. I have a lot of things that I want to say.
This time, Moore's story is very different from the one he told 6 years ago. He states that Walter did show up at his truck stop and asked for his records. Moore told Sullivan they were in the Blue Building and that he should get them himself. He then says he never saw Sullivan again.
And here he comes out with an entirely different set of information, a whole different story. And, of course, it was contrary to everything he told us back in 1989.
Back in 1989, Moore claimed that he met Walter at his home and that he noticed a Native American in his car. He personally handed Walter his records and watched them both drive away.
It's typical when a person is lying to you, a year later or 2 years later, whatever, they don't remember their lies. Everybody remembers the truth, but you can't remember when you lie.
Uribe decides to take a chance. After 6 years, police had no new evidence against Moore, but what they did have was a psychic scenario of how Walter Sullivan was killed, and Uribe uses it on Moore. On the morning of November 13th, 1989, Walter Sullivan meets Eugene Moore at his house to discuss his taxes. Sullivan follows Moore towards his blue shed. It's there that he's ambushed by Moore and two other men. They stuff Sullivan's body into the trunk of his own car, drive 9 miles, and push it off the side of Clark Road, where it drops 250 feet down into a ravine.
Moore had no idea what we knew, and that worked very well for us, because it acted like we had the details of what actually happened on the day of the murder. And the more we got into it, the more broken down he became.
Incredibly, the psychic's version of the crime was true enough to convince Moore to break down and confess.
You could just see an emotional change on his face.
After 6 years, police finally have a confession. But do they have their man?
He went from a very positive, hey, I have something to say here and I want the world to know I didn't do this and here's why. But as we broke him down and as we showed all the discrepancies, you could just see him kind of shirk and shrink in his chair. And then he began to come around to the point where he wanted to, hey, if I confess to this, what's going to happen to me? And then he started trying to make arrangements or cut a deal with us right on the spot to determine how many years in prison he was going to get. He had told us he didn't want to go to prison and that we'd never take him alive.
A psychic's vision is about to go unheeded.
You won't take him alive.
A Montana state auditor is found dead near the small town of Shelby. After 6 years, a co-worker's letter would make state headlines and puts investigator Joe Uribe under the gun to solve the crime. With no new leads, Uribe asks a psychic for help. Her visions of the crime send the police back to their prime suspect. When confronted, he confesses.
His story finally crumbled right before his eyes. He broke down.
At last, police have Eugene Moore exactly where they want him. But instead of taking him into custody, police decide to follow protocol and let him go.
Our Attorney General instructed us not to arrest him because it had been so long since the murder. We wanted to put it into a warrant of arrest with a information that we would file with the judge and let a judge determine, based on the information we had, whether or not there was enough grounds or probable cause to go ahead and make the arrest.
It was a costly mistake, one that the psychic had predicted.
He's so dangerous. You won't take him alive.
He had told us he didn't want to go to prison and that we'd never take him alive. And once he walked out that door, I knew we'd made a big mistake.
When police return the next day with an arrest warrant, Eugene Moore is gone. He's spotted heading towards the Canadian border.
We knew he had a handgun and we knew he had a rifle. And we felt at that point that it was very dangerous. But we had to stop him. We called ahead and radioed ahead and had additional forces come in, and they used stop sticks, which are devices that are used to blow out the tires on a vehicle. And we had them deployed in such a manner that we got his tires flattened. And in the event of that, he even still went 1.5 miles after his tires went down because he didn't want to stop.
Police do all they can to stop Moore, and when they finally do, he tries to shoot himself, fails, and turns his gun on police.
Several shots were exchanged. 2 officers were shot before Mr. Moore was in fact shot and killed.
Noreen's premonition was right. Police would never take Eugene Moore alive.
Officials say it began when they tried to arrest Eugene Moore for a 1989 murder. But minutes later, deputies found themselves on a chase. Moore led them down this road, and that is apparently when the gunfire broke out.
We didn't want him to kill himself or get shot. We wanted him to go to prison. Being these anti-government leanings that he had, didn't feel that he owed the government anything. He's a businessman, and in fact hadn't paid taxes in years.
Eugene Moore's death meant there would be no justice for Walter Sullivan. Any evidence of Moore's accomplices died with him.
All the evidence that we had, nothing could be corroborated. As far as his involvement went, and especially any closure for the victim's family in a court case at all.
We should never have allowed him to get away from us. We should have arrested him on the spot. Looking back on it all, that probably was the biggest mistake in my career.
But there's no mistaking that a psychic's vision helped police to force a killer's hand.
The thing that Noreen Rainier did for us is, police work, we did all the basics. We went back and did all the groundwork. And all the elements were there, but there just wasn't quite enough to make the arrest.
I think I gave them more ammunition and more confidence about what really happened, so when they confronted the murderer, they could bring these things out by my clues, my information, my seeing what happened to Walter and how he was killed.
I, as an investigator, would not discount any information from any source. You get it, you filter it. If it's of use, you use it, you run with it. And that's the way I view the psychic.
I think I'm accurate in all my cases. Never 100%. Nothing is ever 100%, even in this reality. In the psychic world, of course it's not. But I felt very accurate. I felt the pictures were coming. I was seeing clearly. I felt I did my job, and I think I did it well. I don't feel I solve crimes. I think I'm just a small part in helping it come to a successful conclusion.
Sue Moore's efforts to convince the state to reinvestigate would bring Walter's killer down and change the way the state of Montana did business.
Field reps now carry cell phones, are much better about documenting where they are and how long they're going to be. And frankly, if there's any question at all, they subpoena the employer into the sheriff's office. Walt was a tough guy, and he believed he could handle his job. I mean, the reason he asked to be moved out to the field from being a computer guy was he really wanted to work with employers. He had a great talent and skill for it. For me, that was really the great tragedy of Walt's story, was this guy who loved his job, loved what he did, cared so much about providing a good service as a state employee, was not served well, in my opinion, during that time. It was a very awful thing to live through. I cannot imagine what his family went through. As a friend, I know how incredibly painful and tragic it was. To me, there was just a sense that at least it's resolved.
Sue Moore was determined to keep Walter Sullivan's memory alive. She lobbied, and finally in March 2004, 15 years after his death, the state renamed a building in Walter Sullivan's honor.
Walt was, in many ways for me, a mentor. I mean, there's not a time I walk into that building and see that plaque and don't have a memory of Walt in that building. It's great to have that there, but I sure wish we didn't have to have it.
An elderly widow is brutally murdered in her home.
This was an absolute senseless crime.
Police have little evidence and no one's talking.
There were so many people who were afraid that the killers were still in the community.
But a psychic has disturbing visions of the crime.
She had been stabbed so many times.
Can a psychic's insights solve the mystery of who killed Rose Swartwood? Elmira, New York, an historic town of clapboard houses and white picket fences. A town Huckleberry Finn author Mark Twain once called home. A town unaccustomed to crime. But not on August 25th, 1988. On that day, 74-year-old Rose Swartwood, widowed and living alone, is found dead in her apartment. She'd been the victim of a shocking attack. Beaten, bitten, and stabbed to death.
I think the nature of the crime, being an elderly woman that lived alone, was very upsetting.
It caught a lot of the media attention and upset a lot of the people in the community.
I mean, it was a terrible, heinous crime.
Mike Moosey from the local sheriff's office and Corky Patterson from the Elmira Police Department are assigned to investigate this gruesome case.
Yeah, there hadn't been a murder in Elmira in several years.
Jim Pfeiffer is a journalist who covered the story.
What bothered people the most, I thought, was this is a woman who's innocent, who has no enemies. It could happen to me. You know, it isn't supposed to happen to anyone, but especially to people like this.
It was believed from the very beginning of this investigation that it was possibly a burglary gone to a homicide rather than a planned homicide. I think we felt quite strongly that this was not anticipated to be a homicide from the beginning, but more a burglary gone bad.
Moosey and Patterson face major problems. Despite the apparent frenzy of the murder, little forensic evidence was left behind by Rose's killers.
The crime scene was very cleaned up. There were some things disturbed still when the police arrived there, but it appeared they had scrubbed down the walls and the floors with some type of cleaning agent.
Not only this, but locals are reluctant to talk.
A lot of times people just would clam up, or they'd give them false information. So it would make it more difficult for the police, who in this community were used to quickly solving a crime.
Rose lived in one of Elmira's tougher neighborhoods, the Hawthorne Court housing project.
I believe there were people that felt they would be threatened if they cooperated with the police.
Scores of potential suspects are interviewed and eliminated. Only 2 rise to the top of the list. William Cuddy and Demetrius Moore, both local, both well known to police.
We were relatively certain who these suspects were and what their involvement in the crime was.
With little evidence to tie Cuddy and Moore to the crime scene and no witnesses prepared to come forward, the investigation gradually stalls.
There were so many people who were afraid that the killers were still in the community. Police being blamed for not doing a good job, when that wasn't the case. They were doing a good job. They just couldn't get a lot of cooperation, a lot of information.
Months pass with no new leads. The case grows cold. But detectives Moosey and Patterson don't give up. They're not about to let Rose Swartwood's killers away with murder. 2 years after her homicide, with nothing to lose, Detective Moosey decides to try something very different. He decides to enlist a psychic.
I had heard about Phil Jordan from other law enforcement agencies. I had never been to him before.
Phil Jordan is one of America's best-known psychics, with a strong track record of helping cops solve difficult crimes.
I have been working with the police for the past 35 years.
Jordan uses photographs to make a psychic connection to crime scenes.
When I work on a case, I will take a picture of the victim. And as I look at that picture, I start seeing things about that person.
Detectives decide to tell Jordan nothing about Rose Swartwood or her murder.
When Corky and Mike came to the first meeting, they brought a picture of Rose Swartwood with them. And I looked at that picture and did a reading.
Right away, Jordan surprises the police.
The perpetrators, I felt, came into the dwelling believing they were going to do a burglary, and they were surprised to find that there was a person in the house. And then I feel as though both the perpetrators felt as though the whole situation went completely wrong, that they had gotten much more involved than they wanted to in the crime itself.
Jordan claims his visions reveal not only what happened during the crime, but also what the killers did after.
Then I felt as though they would try to put things back the way they had found it.
Again, the cops are surprised. Jordan has just identified the reason their investigation has so little physical evidence. But the big question is, can he tell them who killed Rose Swartwood? To find out, they hand him a stack of photos.
I took probably between 50 and 75 mugshots of various people to see if any of them had any significance to him whatsoever.
We had pictures of people who had been suspects but ruled out, and we had pictures of people who we didn't think had any involvement whatsoever. No names on any of the photographs or anything.
Just quietly, we sat there for approximately 10 or 15 minutes as he flipped through several mugshots. And I noticed, as did Sergeant Patterson, he pulled out a picture of Bill Cuddy and set it aside. He then continued to flip through the photographs, and probably 20 or 30 photographs later, he pulled a mugshot of Demetrius Moore, and he laid that down.
I felt one of the perpetrators would be black and one of them would be white.
It was a moment that would change the course of a 2-year investigation.
When he pulled those 2 pictures out and set them aside, I was trying my best not to look at Sergeant Patterson, but he had pulled out our 2 prime suspects.
With no prior knowledge, how could the psychic have zeroed in on the 2 prime suspects?
Just about everything that he described was pretty much on the money.
But can a psychic's dark visions help police find justice for Rose Swartwood? For 2 years, Elmira, New York area detectives Mike Moosey and Corky Patterson have been hunting the vicious killer of an elderly widow.
Very unusual for us to have a crime like that. It was extremely rare here.
With little evidence and no witnesses, the police investigation had hit a wall, until a psychic identifies the two prime suspects who, up to now, detectives haven't had the evidence to arrest.
When he completed going through all the photographs, he put the rest of them down and said that he felt the two that he had pulled out, that being the photographs of Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy, were in fact the two people that he felt were directly involved in the crime of the death of Rose Swartwood.
William Cuddy is a name very familiar to Elmira police.
Cuddy was doing time. He pled guilty in June of '89 to the sexual abuse charge that I had originally investigated him on.
William Cuddy was a suspect because a jailhouse informant had contacted Detective Moosey saying Cuddy had been bragging in jail about killing Rose. But when the detective tried to question Cuddy, the prisoner wouldn't talk.
He had an incredible loss of memory. He did not wish to remember any of the details and immediately posed a problem for us.
Demetrius Moore is another story.
Demetrius Moore was actually a neighbor of the victim and was questioned along with several other people as a potential suspect.
Moore has remained a suspect because he had a motive. He blamed Rose and her complaints about his loud music for his eviction from Hawthorne Court.
In fact, a few weeks prior to her death, some obscenities were written on her back door. It was alleged that Demetrius was the one that was responsible for putting those obscenities on the back door.
People in the neighborhood are afraid of Demetrius Moore. Rumors on the street say he is linked to the criminal underworld. His reputation has been a major stumbling block to the investigation.
Demetrius was free and on the street, and which was another thing that hampered some people wanting to cooperate with us.
By pulling the two mugshots, Phil Jordan has confirmed the suspicions of the detectives. Now the psychic has a vision of the actual crime.
Whenever I work a case, I not only try to discover how the person may have died, but I also try to figure out what the injuries were inflicted with. In this case, I felt as though she was stabbed, and I could feel that there'd be a rather long knife that was used.
If one was to read the autopsy report, they'd understand that Mr. Jordan's descriptions were quite correct.
The psychic also claims he can see which of the two suspects actually stabbed Rose.
Phil described to us that the person who did the actual slaying, the actual killing itself, would have a tattoo on their shoulder.
I noticed a marking on his arm that would be a tattoo, and I felt that it had a woman's name in it, but I couldn't make out the woman's name.
I knew that Cuddy had such a tattoo on his left shoulder. Mike was not aware of it. No one else connected with the case was aware of it.
And that he was the perpetrator, the assailant that killed Rose Swartwood.
The tattoo is a stunning revelation, one that Jordan had no way of knowing.
Yeah, he was able to describe Mr. Cuddy as being a vicious person, a person who hated women, had a deep hatred for women.
After 2 frustrating years, Detectives Moosey and Patterson's visit to Phil Jordan re-energizes the case. More than ever, they believe Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy are responsible for the death of Rose Swartwood.
We left there with some pretty surprising feelings that he had told us things about Cuddy that probably not a lot of people had known or even investigated.
But now the police must prove that Cuddy and Moore are the killers, and it's not going to be easy.
So we continued to build the case, and we weren't going to jump before we had all the evidence we could collect and all the information that we needed.
A major difficulty has been placing Cuddy and Moore at the crime scene. The detectives revisit the forensic evidence.
There was a sample of blood that was found at the point of entry, which is a rear door, a small broken window.
The drop of blood doesn't match the DNA of either Rose Swartwood or William Cuddy, but trying to match it to Demetrius Moore has stymied the police.
You would have to apply for a court order. And in this case, in order to get a court order, you would at least need enough evidence to substantiate that this person was a viable suspect. Initially, we didn't feel we had enough evidence to do that.
The other piece of forensic evidence comes from the victim's body, bite marks. In the struggle before she died, Rose Swartwood was bitten on the shoulder.
Bite marks are very difficult to identify most of the time, especially when the victim is the receiver of the bite mark.
Though the psychic and the cops both believe William Cuddy stabbed Rose, the investigators don't believe he bit her, and for good reason.
Mr. Cuddy wore dentures, and it was clear that the person who did the biting didn't wear dentures.
If Moore and Cuddy were accomplices in the murder, Moore must be the one who did the biting.
There was actually a photograph taken of Demetrius Moore's teeth on the day of the homicide. When he was being interviewed, the detectives thought enough and were smart enough to take a voluntary picture of his teeth.
Demetrius Moore's teeth may be the key to solving the murder mystery, but he's about to do something no one could ever imagine. For 2 years, detectives Mike Moosey and Corky Patterson have been investigating the murder of elderly widow Rose Swartwood.
This was an absolute senseless crime from the very beginning.
Psychic Phil Jordan has identified the two prime suspects, Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy.
At the time of the incident, I believe that I felt one of the perpetrators would be black and one of them would be white.
Detectives have only 2 significant pieces of evidence: a single drop of blood and bite marks found on the victim. Police believe the bite marks belong to Demetrius Moore, but before they can prove it, Moore does something very strange.
The unique thing there was it was found that Demetrius had filed his teeth.
Using a chisel, incredibly, Moore files down his own teeth. What's worse for detectives, they're still unable to obtain a warrant to test Moore's DNA or indeed make a mold of his now damaged teeth. Frustrated, the detectives return to Phil Jordan. What they really want to know is what connects their 2 prime suspects.
There was no information, or anyone had never come forward to put those 2 together at any given time.
Again, the psychic, who has been told nothing about the case, amazes the detectives. He confirms their belief that Cuddy and Moore were together at a party the night Rose was killed.
I felt as I observed the party, it would be a party I would not want to go to because I know I would feel uncomfortable by the character of people that were there. I could see that it was people having a good time, but yet more for the sake of partying to probably drink and get high.
The party is crucial to the investigation. It's the potential link that puts Cuddy and Moore together the night of the murder.
When we learned about the party initially occurring the night of the homicide, it was very difficult for us to get people at the party to remember who came, who left, who was there, who came with who. So locating people that were at the party for additional information on these 2 or anyone else that might have been with them was very difficult for a period of time.
I remember very distinctly seeing the house where I felt that the party had taken place, that there would have to be an enclosed stairwell going up the outside of the house.
He felt that the house was, I believe he said, green in color and had a very distinct outside staircase which led to a 2nd floor, which Sergeant Patterson and I knew to be the location of the party house.
I felt as though they would be first at the party, they would leave the party, commit this heinous act, and then go back to the party, which showed me they probably had little conscience.
Is Jordan's paranormal vision correct? Detectives in Elmira, New York are closer than ever to solving the murder of Rose Swartwood. Armed with a psychic's visions of the crime, they confront reluctant witnesses.
We did have people that came forward, finally, and did remember Cuddy coming with Demetrius Moore. Yes, that link was finally made.
Those witnesses now paint a startling portrait of Moore and Cuddy's behavior the night of the murder.
Demetrius and Cuddy left the party, supposed to go get some beer and money for beer and drugs or whatever. When they returned, Cuddy had a lot of blood on him. Demetrius had a small amount on him, and there was some argument out on the porch, and I believe Demetrius was saying something like, you didn't have to kill her like that.
Once again, Phil Jordan was right. Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy were together the night Rose Swartwood was killed. Finally, police have the link that puts their suspects together the night of the crime. They can now get the court order to compare Moore's DNA with that single drop of blood found at the crime scene.
We certainly felt confident that there would be a match, or at least a grouping that was consistent with, which would be sound evidence against him being at the scene of the crime, which he had denied, for years at this point.
Demetrius Moore's DNA matches the blood found on Rose Swartwood's broken window. Moore and Cuddy are charged with the second-degree murder of Rose Swartwood. At the trial, Moore challenges one of the key pieces of evidence against him, that he filed down his teeth.
The most unusual thing I ever saw on a witness stand. His excuse was, when he took the stand, his teeth were chipped up like that because he opened beer bottles with his teeth. And he opened up 2 beer bottles on the stand. His lawyer wanted to show the jury on the stand.
What it didn't do is alter the pattern of his teeth. It certainly altered the ridges of the teeth.
So they couldn't match the bite marks exactly. It didn't do him any good to file his teeth.
Evidence at the trial showed Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy met at the party house. When they ran out of drugs and alcohol, Moore suggested they rob Rose.
Unfortunately, she had returned home that evening and was found in the apartment. She had apparently been getting ready for bed or just going to bed when the entry was made.
The robbers surprised Rose. There was a struggle. Moore bit the elderly, defenseless victim on the shoulder. Then William Cuddy began to stab her, and he stabbed her over 40 times. After killing Rose Swartwood, Cuddy and Moore dragged her body to her bed, and before leaving, they methodically washed the blood from the floor and the walls, missing just a single drop. Demetrius Moore and William Cuddy are both found guilty, and both men are sentenced to 25 years.
I can't speak for the jury, so I don't know if it had an impact on the jury or on the trial. It had an impact on me that someone could not only brutally murder a 72 or 74-year-old woman this way, but then stay around and clean it up afterwards. They have to have no remorse, no conscience.
Today, the detectives are still amazed at the accuracy of Phil Jordan's visions. The psychic pulled William Cuddy and Demetrius Moore's photo from a stack of mugshots and identified Cuddy as the killer by a tattoo on his shoulder. Phil described the attack as a robbery gone bad and the party house where Cuddy and Moore hatched their plan.
A good psychic can provide you with leads or something, or an avenue to go on when you don't have any.
He's done some pretty amazing things.
They wanted to resolve the case for the family and for Rose, but they also wanted the community to be safe.
In Memphis, Tennessee, someone is killing prostitutes. Police make an arrest, but a psychic tells a homicide cop he's got it wrong.
I knew that he had arrested the wrong man.
We knew we had the right man. There was just no doubt about it.
Then the killer strikes again. Can the psychic help the cop to catch a psychopath before he kills again and again?
It was totally evil.
Perched on the banks of the Mississippi and home to the blues and rock and roll, where Elvis lived and died. Memphis, Tennessee is one of the most famous cities in America.
Memphis is like the capital of the Mid-South. It's completely different from the rest of the state. We have the river. We have the blues.
But Memphis is also one of the most dangerous cities in America. It's a city with a long tradition of crime and violence.
Memphis was always known as a fairly violent river town. In fact, during one period of time in the 20s, Memphis was one of the most violent cities in the United States.
Anywhere from homicides to assaults to prostitution, working the street. There was a lot of drugs.
There are parts of South Memphis that you don't want to go.
August 15th, 1988. 25-year-old Sharon Denise Moore is working the street in the notorious South Memphis red light district. But her last trick turns deadly. She is shot at point-blank range with a .32 caliber handgun. It's the 95th murder in Memphis that year. It doesn't take homicide detectives long to line up a prime suspect. 2 witnesses finger a man named Larry Ward.
They had canvassed the area and sent some people back out to where he had been, and actually had statements from 2 witnesses who basically tied him to the victim prior to her death.
And he left with her and came back by himself and had a pistol.
Cops soon track Ward down and corner him close to the scene of the crime. After a brief chase, he is quickly arrested.
They felt that they had a pretty good case on him, and that's the reason he was charged.
The very next day, however, the routine homicide takes a bizarre twist. Carol Pate, a psychic visiting Memphis on vacation, has an unexpected and disturbing vision about the murder, even though that murder has not been made public.
I got a vision, intuitive knowledge, if you will, that there was a serial murderer on the loose in Memphis. Hi, I'm looking for Captain.
She immediately calls Captain Ken East of the homicide squad.
A lot of police departments really don't like to get involved with psychics, but I've always been open-minded.
I told him that I had this vision of this serial murderer and that he was stalking and pursuing prostitutes and shooting them. And I told him I had references with other police departments, and if he felt that what I was giving him was important, I'd like to meet with him.
There's no reason not to respond to her as long as she seemed like she was on the up and up.
Carol Pate uses a technique known as psychometry to connect with her paranormal subjects.
An actual photograph of a crime scene contains the signature frequency of both the victim and the murderer.
When she touches it, she says she can tune in like a radio to receive information.
I can then go into the past, present, future. He showed me some photographs, crime scene photographs, and I began to get some information. Number 1 was I knew that he had arrested the wrong man.
The wrong man. Is it possible Larry Ward is not the killer? Or has the psychic made a mistake?
The witnesses had said that he was in there bragging about shooting the girl. So we knew we had the right man. There was just no doubt about it.
It didn't really make a lot of sense to him. Nothing to back up the information that I had.
And I told her I appreciated it, and if we had anything come up, I'd call her.
I felt like I would hear from him again.
Ken East ignores the psychic's strange visions. Six weeks later, another prostitute is murdered. She's shot with the same type of gun as the first victim. Police immediately suspect Larry Ward, who had been released on bail until his trial.
He'd been out for 3 days, so we picked him up again.
But the cops are wrong. Ward surprises them with a solid alibi. At the time of the second murder, he was in a restaurant miles away. A dozen witnesses back up his story.
It doesn't make sense because here you've got him so well on the first one and with witnesses, and so we go back to those same witnesses and re-interview them and offer them a polygraph, and it turns out they were mad at him and they lied on him.
Ken East's open and shut case is suddenly blown wide open.
We were at the dead end. It was block 1, start all over.
Carol Pate was right after all.
So I picked up the phone, called her, and I said, well, our case kind of fell through.
It was in fact true that he had the wrong man.
2 murders, and Memphis homicide has no suspects. Now Carol Pate makes a chilling prediction.
This was a serial murder. This was not going to be 1 or 2. It was going to be more.
This time, will the police listen? In South Memphis, 2 prostitutes have been shot dead. Police arrest a suspect, Larry Ward. But psychic Carol Pate tells a homicide detective he's made a mistake. Further investigation proves she's right.
It was in fact true that he had the wrong man in custody.
Now, desperate to catch a killer who had already struck twice, and with nothing to lose, Captain Ken East reconnects with the psychic.
He wanted to know if I'd be willing to come to Memphis to go to a crime scene. I said, sure, if that'll help.
Okay, great.
Even so, Ken East decides to keep his meeting and his relationship with Carol a secret.
Some of the investigators that were working on the case, they work hard on it, and if they think that I'm having them follow up on leads from that's given to me by psychics, they're not going to be happy about it.
Ken and Carol meet at the scene of the second murder. 28-year-old Laria Ann DeBerry had been shot twice. The bullets confirm she had been shot with the same gun as Sharon Moore. But who pulled the trigger? Can the psychic help the detective?
Okay. I asked for a photograph of the actual body at the crime scene. And I used that along with the energy of the location where the body had been found. It's right in through here. So that I could then get the energy of the murderer. I was able to see the murderer, to describe the murderer. I saw an Afro-American man in his early 40s. He had a goatee. He had more refined features. Wiry build, 5'8", 5'9".
Ken East takes notes on everything the psychic says.
That's a lot of description from anybody, even a witness.
Now Carol Pate's insights take her inside the mind of a killer.
This man is a multiple personality. But the murdering personality is named Al.
She doesn't know if that's what part of the name that is, but that's Al. She's coming up with that.
Carol sees 2 opposite personalities in the killer.
I got a shy personality, the true personality. But Al was a very strong, violent, evil personality. Al wants to take over.
Carol's vision of Al is chilling.
He is compelled to kill. This was a serial murder. This was not going to be 1 or 2. It was going to be more.
Ken East isn't taking any chances. He decides to use the psychic's description of the murderer in his investigation.
It would give us more to talk to the witnesses in the scene where the prostitutes were hanging out. The more you give, the more they'll give you back.
He's not done.
The psychic and the cop agree to keep in close touch. Ken gives Carol photographs of the crime scenes and the victims to tune in on any new visions of Al.
I said, you have an open line to me. You call me if anything comes to you.
What I was looking for when I was tuning into the energy is what we could do to catch him. What was his next move? Who was his next victim? Where was it going to be?
They don't have long to wait. A week after the DeBarry murder, the badly decomposed body of another prostitute, 30-year-old Linda Tratt, is found hidden in an alley.
We knew there was something fishy because the prostitutes were being killed.
With this discovery, the homicide investigation is expanded. Sergeant John Garner is put in charge.
That case was assigned to me, and then I inherited them all and became the lead investigator on all the cases.
With the body count rising, John Garner and Ken East both suspect Carol Pate's prediction is true. A serial killer is stalking prostitutes in South Memphis.
We felt sure if we didn't get on top of it that there would be some more bodies found.
10 days later, there is another shooting. 22-year-old Tony Thompson, a transvestite dressed as a woman, is driven to a remote street corner, dropped off, and then shot twice. This time the killer makes his first blunder. Tony is badly wounded, but alive, the first real witness.
He'd been shot 2 times, and 1 bullet was still in his body. So we took him to the hospital and had the doctors remove the bullet, and they did match.
Tony Thompson is able to give police a detailed description of his assailant. Incredibly, one that matches the description Carol Pate gave to Ken East.
A lot of sketches don't turn out to be exactly like the person looks either, but that sketch kind of fit her description that she'd given, and I was impressed with that.
Meanwhile, using materials sent to her by the detective, Carol has more visions of the murderer. But she has difficulty seeing past the killer's evil personality, Al.
Al was overwhelming. I couldn't see where he lived because when he would go home, Al would go away. And here would be this shy, quiet man that barely had a handle on sanity.
Prostitutes on the street confirm Carol's and the transvestite's description of the killer.
We showed our sketch, and some of the ladies of the night had seen this man.
But investigators still don't know who he is. What the police, the psychic, and the prostitutes of South Memphis do know, however, is that the killer is getting bolder. 6 days after Tony Thompson is shot, 37-year-old Joyce Thomas is killed with the same gun in the same area.
When the third murder came in down on Peebles Road that was tied to the 32, we had bullets compared, and we knew all 3 came from the same gun.
With the third killing, police released the news to the public. There is a serial killer in South Memphis. TV reporter Kathy Thurmond Edwards was assigned to cover the story.
And all of a sudden we have this on the news and a serial killer. It was quite bizarre.
3 months have passed since Carol Pate told police that they had arrested the wrong man for the murder of a young woman. It's now clear that a vicious killer matching the description that the psychic gave Captain Ken East is targeting prostitutes in a South Memphis red light district. Can the cop and the psychic catch him before he strikes again?
He was totally evil and violent, incredibly violent.
A serial killer is shooting prostitutes in South Memphis. 3 women are now dead. And psychic Carol Pate has given a homicide detective an insight into the mind of the killer.
This man is a multiple personality, but the murdering personality is named Al. This was not going to be 1 or 2. It was going to be more.
With each shooting, police intensify their investigation. The time between each murder is getting shorter. With a serial killer on the loose, all of Memphis is on edge.
Here we are in the Mid-South, the Bible Belt, and we've got this strange story about a serial killer targeting prostitutes and transvestites. It was the talk of the town.
But police aren't totally in the dark. Carol's description is confirmed by the only eyewitness, a transvestite who survived a shooting. He also gives police another lead, a vague description of the killer's small gray car. This also fits with what detectives have been hearing on the street.
Anybody talking to prostitutes on the street? Have you had any trouble? And yeah, I had trouble with a male black, and he was driving a gray car. And
so we knew we'd kind of narrowed down to the small gray car point.
Back at her home, Carol has another psychic vision.
Hi, this is Carol Pay.
The psychic calls Captain Ken East with new information. She feels that the killer is about to murder again, but there is a twist.
I saw into the future that his next victim was going to be at a stone church in that area where the other murders had occurred. I didn't think we could stop the murder, but I knew that he could be captured because of the stone church.
We have several that fit that description, and they were downtown area. We passed this information on to the Uniform Patrol and the Vice Squad and told them to be on the lookout.
Armed with the information, police step up patrols in the area. But despite that increased presence, the very next night the killer strikes again. He shoots another transvestite, 30-year-old Mark Eric Lewis, near the Claiborne Temple, the oldest and biggest stone church in Memphis, just as the psychic had predicted. But again, he only wounds his victim, and Lewis is able to run for his life and call for help. The next day, Lewis relives his ordeal to reporter Kathy Thurmond Edwards.
All I could see was fire. And I said, "Oh, you shot me." He said, "Shut up." And I went to reach and grab him. I remember pushing him, because I pushed him, he fell back. That's how I got the second shot hit me in the neck.
Finally, police get a big break. An officer in the area spotted a small gray car leaving the scene of the crime.
Lieutenant Ralph Roby, who was a night detective lieutenant, was en route to the scene of where Lewis was shot, and he saw a small gray car in the area and just jotted down the tag number. When we came into work that morning at 8 o'clock, he was getting off. He came by Homestead and said, "I saw this last night. It may be of help, may not."
And we ran the license number and found out that it belonged to James Barnes.
James Barnes is a 44-year-old delivery man who lives and works in South Memphis.
So we go to their house and talk to his wife, Diane, and she said that her husband's been driving the car and been going out at night and that kind of thing. And so we still didn't have as much evidence as we really liked, so we decided to set up a surveillance on him.
The theory was that if he leaves the house, goes to a prostitute area to pick a prostitute up, take him down in hopes of finding the weapon. If you don't have the weapon, at least we can talk to him and maybe get him to confess to it, basically.
The very next night, James Barnes drives back into the red light district of South Memphis. Homicide detectives follow him closely.
And what we're trying to do is follow him to the crime scene areas in that area part of town. And he did, in fact, go there. Well, they tried to stop him at that point because we didn't want anybody else to get hurt.
He stopped in front of the Lorraine Motel, the site of Martin Luther King's assassination 20 years earlier. Barnes tries to escape, but detectives are right behind him. Finally, he's cornered, and police arrest James Barnes.
At daylight, the investigating detectives went back out on the scene and did find a gun, and it was a .32 caliber.
The gun found at the scene of the arrest is confirmed to be the same one that killed and wounded all of the prostitutes. With James Barnes in custody, questions still remain. What motivated his killing spree? And is Carol Pate's prediction that he suffers from a split personality correct?
We came down to interview him in the homicide office, and then at one point he wanted us to handcuff him. We basically said, you know, what's going on with you, Barnes? And he said, you know, I'm not him, my name's Al.
The psychic was right. Al was behind the killings.
Al wanted Barnes to kill his wife and children, and he would argue with him, and every time he wanted that to happen, that's when he would go out and pick up a prostitute and commit a murder to satisfy Al.
How could the psychic have known about the evil personality called Al locked inside the killer's head?
You've got to be impressed with the name Al when he's sitting there during the interrogation and he starts acting crazy and asks you to handcuff him so that he won't hurt you or himself.
Barnes was in there, but I could barely feel him, and I felt a reluctancy from him to do what was happening. But Al was overwhelming.
But the psychic has even more information. 2 weeks after Barnes is arrested, Carol Pate calls Ken East back with a vision.
Ken, I think I have some more information for you. I saw that he had taken clothing of another victim and had left it on the banks of the Mississippi. It's between a church, a small church, and the old bridge.
Of course, I had no recourse but to send somebody out there at that point. I mean, after I've been dealing with her so long, I had no reason not to.
After a search, a detective finds blood-stained clothes exactly where the psychic said they would be. A few days later, the clothes are identified as belonging to Linda Tratt, whose decomposed body had been found 4 weeks earlier.
We were all very impressed that we found what we found. It's just one more thing that was tied together as evidence.
But the bullet that killed Linda Tratt was never found, so Barnes can't be charged with her murder. Police charged James Barnes with the murders of Sharon Moore, Loria Ann DeBerry, and Joyce Thomas. District Attorney John Campbell prosecutes Barnes in court.
You can be a multiple personality and not be insane. You know, if the personality that's controlling you at that particular time knows the difference between right and wrong, he's competent.
Barnes eventually pleads guilty to all 3 murders. Today, he is being held in a prison hospital where he will remain for the rest of his life. In this remarkable case, psychic Carol Pate was right about almost every detail. The police did arrest the wrong man. She provided an accurate description of the killer.
Wiry build, 5'8", 5'9".
She knew he had multiple personalities and that the personality behind the killings was named Al. And she predicted that he would be caught near a stone church. She even made a believer out of Captain Ken East.
So any time that you get information that's from somebody that has no reason to know it, and then you find the information is in fact true, you have to be impressed with that.
Carol Pate's uncanny psychic visions undoubtedly helped a cop catch a killer who had terrorized Memphis for months.
I wanted him caught. That was the important thing. He had to be stopped.
In Homestead, Pennsylvania, someone is raping elderly women in the dead of night.
That was a despicable crime.
Certainly a lot of fear.
Police have clues, but no suspects.
Somebody that we knew and that was just getting off, watching us.
Then a psychic has a vision of the attacks.
Horrible violence and screaming.
And the attacker.
This guy was like Spider-Man.
She also makes a chilling prediction.
We were going to have a murder rather than a vicious assault.
Can her mysterious visions help the police to catch a rapist before he becomes a killer? Homestead, Pennsylvania, a small neighborly town on the outskirts of Pittsburgh.
You knew the next door neighbors so well, they were like your own family.
A town built on steel.
Armor for tanks, armor for the ships. We were very much an important part of World War II in Homestead.
But in the mid-1980s, U.S. Steel is leaving Homestead, and with it, 15,000 jobs disappear.
It sort of was like a death blow to Homestead.
And something else is unraveling the fabric of this close-knit community. A rapist is attacking elderly women in their own homes in the dead of night.
It's like somebody raped my mother.
The first assault took place on August 10th, 1983. An 86-year-old woman living alone is attacked and raped in her bedroom. Detective Tom Hobart is the first officer on the scene.
Most people in the town knew each other. If you didn't know them, you knew family members. You knew someone associated with that family. That was a despicable crime. We'd take a lead and we would exhaust that lead. We worked that case for a number of years, and it seemed like at everything we were doing, we were running into dead ends.
No arrest is made and the case goes cold. But 2 years later, a 61-year-old woman is raped in her second-floor bedroom, a carbon copy of the first assault.
I was born and raised in this town. The first two victims I knew personally. These are our folks. These are our people. We knew them. We knew their sons, their daughters.
People tend to forget. They didn't immediately associate the two crimes. We, however, associated immediately just because of the MO, if you will.
Though police know the rapes are connected, they have no suspect.
The victims never saw anything. The victim would awake with him placing something over their face, whether it was a pillow, a blanket, whatever he could. But he always covered their face.
We knew fingerprints matched, but we couldn't match them to anybody at the time. We had serology matches and pubic hair samples.
Forensics evidence told us that he was a black male. We knew he was a rather large man. The victims, when they would describe, they'd actually use their hands and say, you know, I grabbed him and his arms were big.
You take a small area that is saturated with dogs and none of the dogs barked. We knew that this individual responsible lived in the immediate neighborhood.
He was probably a younger man because his method of entering these homes, he had to be strong, he had to be agile. Forensically, we had the evidence from the very beginning. We just didn't have a suspect.
But you got to imagine, other crimes go on. We're a small town, a small department, so we had to pool resources as we need them. We couldn't let the rest of the town suffer because of these incidents.
The rapist leaves clues, but the police still have no suspects, and there is no arrest. Then, 18 months later, a third attack. A 75-year-old widow raped in her second-floor bedroom.
Evidence was pointing to one person that they realized they had a serial rapist on their hands.
The interviewing the women broke your heart. It was very, very embarrassing for them to sit down and talk to me. I was a young man. It just became very personal.
Saving this community was our mission.
The frustration had set in from not being able to find the assailant.
I don't think Hobart went home for a week. I mean, when he did go home, I had to order him home.
With the culprit still at large, Detective Hobart does something unusual. His brother met a psychic at a party and suggests she might be able to help.
He's very skeptical of psychics, and he had went to a party in the Greensburg area, where Nancy's from, and he had met her at the party, and that she was a psychic, and she did a couple neat things that he thought were pretty neat. We chased all our forensic leads down. We hit dead ends with those. When you ask a policeman how to do something, you get a police response. Policemen think the same way. We may as well get someone in from the outside who can give us a new perspective. Whether it was good information or bad information, it was going to be new information. And when he gave me this idea, I thought, why not?
You know, I kind of fluffed it off at first, and then I realized, you know, he's serious. And I said, hey, let's go for it. See what can happen. It certainly couldn't hurt.
Nancy Meyer is a psychic who specializes in what she calls ranging.
What I usually use when I'm working on cases, the environment itself. The whole environment absorbs what happened. It runs as a movie, but I'm in it, and I can pull the information out.
I contact Nancy, and I asked Nancy if she could meet with me, maybe provide me with whatever she could do to help.
give me a time and I'll be there, because these women who were being assaulted were the age of my own mother.
I had hoped that Nancy would come in and say, here we go, this is the guy you're looking for, let's go knock on his door, and I'd open the door and I'd arrest him and the case would be over. That's not what happened.
But before the psychic gets a chance to meet the detective, there is another rape, just 2 weeks after the third. A 64-year-old woman is viciously assaulted in her second-floor bedroom, but police still have no one in their sights. When they finally meet, Detective Hobart tells the psychic nothing about the case.
I wanted her to be able to come in and tell me something, not me tell her. She did request that her and I walk the general area because she said that she would get a better read, a better vibrations on what she was looking for. I walked several steps behind Nancy and let Nancy lead the way.
As they walk through the 2-block area where all 4 of the rapes occurred, Nancy Meyer appears to tune in on the crimes.
Several times, she stopped right in front of one of the homes and would say, I'm getting some bad feelings from this house.
The assaults were so bad, it came right through the walls of the house.
Okay. Somehow, Nancy Meyer is able to pinpoint information that only the police knew. Remarkably, she is able to tell the detective in which homes the attacks occurred.
Picking the homes where the assaults took place, it was uncanny. She was saying things that no one told her, but I knew to be fact already.
And now, Nancy claims she can see the actual attacks.
In the images, I saw that he was African American. It was his neighborhood. He knew the streets. He knew how to get from one house to the other. He even recognized the people. And then I'd be looking up at the side of the house, realizing this guy was like Spider-Man. He climbed drain pipes. He went up the sides of houses. He was going in second-story windows. He clearly enjoyed the risk.
As to how that entry was made, were very, very accurate, as if she almost knew what had taken place.
He would come in the window, and he would stand for a while looking at his victim sleeping. And it was very clear by the time I got to the 4th property that I was picking up the exact same thought patterns on every single one of those properties. There was no deviation.
But what she tells the detective next is something he didn't know.
It was a street light, and as he turned to look to the street, I got a good visual of his face.
So I asked her, I said, if you could draw, could you draw him? And she said, yeah.
And I said, holy hell, we got the break we've been hunting for.
But is it enough to stop a serial rapist before he strikes again? In Homestead, Pennsylvania, a faceless rapist is targeting elderly women in their homes. Stymied, the police call in a psychic for help.
Whether it was good information or bad information, it was going to be new information.
Who claims to see the attacker's face.
And as he turned, I got a good visual of his face.
Something no one up to now had been able to do.
We got the break we've been hunting for.
Because Nancy's psychic description of the rapist is so specific, Detective Hobart brings in a police sketch artist.
He's got a broad face, the eyes.
Mainly we use composites and sketch artists to eliminate people more so than who it is, it's who it isn't. Most people have seen the overlays that are... We actually had a sketch artist that did the drawings. He changed whatever Nancy was feeling it wasn't right. He changed.
He has this leather hat. Every time I visualize him, he has this hat on.
Normal practice is to remove anything like a hat from the sketch so as to focus on the suspect's features, but producing a police sketch based on the word of a psychic is anything but normal.
I'm off to the side. I have nothing to do with Nancy explaining the sketch artist. I'm just accompanying her. And it's a long day. The hat's not right. You have to move the hat this way. You have to move. I was becoming frustrated, and the sketch artist was becoming frustrated. It's a hat. It's a hat. You know, but no, a hat had to be a certain way.
But we got in an argument over the hat. You don't put a hat on a sketch. This is against protocol. You don't do it. And I said, yes, but if people are to recognize him, the hat has to be on him because he's never without it.
As far as a clue that we were going to go out and everybody had a hat on, and that wasn't the situation. A lot of people wear hats. Nancy explained a black leather cap, and she had it over and over, I felt sorry for the sketch artist, how many times she made him change the hat.
And we told our officers, look, this is not an official wanted poster. This is not something that a victim of a crime has produced. This came from Nancy, a psychic.
And as most people have seen sketch artists, they're never going to be a photograph. But we were still looking at this saying, hey, it's better than what we had.
A very broad nose at the bottom.
But before the psychic sketch is even circulated, the rapist strikes yet again. April 24th, 1987, just 5 weeks after the last attack, a 76-year-old widow is assaulted in her home.
Each one escalated that he became much more aggressive.
The entire town is on edge.
Not panic, but it was certainly a lot of fear.
We had now formed an actual task force where we were on the streets every day.
So there were a lot of tired policemen from Allegheny County and the sheriff's departments.
With the attacks intensifying, police ask the psychic for help again, but this time she takes a different approach.
And I said, I think we need to get ahead of this guy and start using my abilities to figure out where he's going to target next. And as we crossed over one street, I could pick up this man walking around late at night, checking out when people's lights were going off. And I noticed that he was on this street quite a bit. And I said to Tommy, this has to be near where he's living, because I keep sensing him.
And what the psychic says next is the last thing that police wanted to hear.
Nancy said, we have to get this guy. We're going to have to get him soon because
we were going to have a murder rather than a vicious assault.
And with the psychic's next revelation, the investigation takes an astonishing turn.
And I felt him checking a house out particularly closely.
And she said, this is not one of your victims, but I'm getting some bad energy coming from this house. Do you know who lives here? There was no indication of the house that who lived there. There was no special signs on the door or anything like that. It looked like any other house in the neighborhood. So when she picked that out, it raised the hair on my neck, because there was no reason for Nancy to be able to pick that particular house out and not knowing anything about the resident of the house. However, I knew that that was a relative of the chief's.
For Police Chief Kelly, the case has just become up close and personal. He takes the psychic's warning seriously and stakes out his grandmother's house.
I got my German Shepherd. Tell him to come on. Bring it on. When you're sitting there in the silence waiting for something brutal to come in, you knew that probably it was going to be a life or death situation. You're aware of every single sound in the night. You can hear your heart pound. Adrenaline takes over. And you're crushed when any of these ladies are victimized the way they were. And it's personal.
But the chief's grandmother isn't the next to fall prey to the rapist. 2 weeks after Nancy's chilling prediction, on a hot June night, an 86-year-old woman living just yards from the chief's grandmother becomes victim number 6.
I was devastated. It was at a lady's house who shared the same alley and the same ethnic last name. In fact, they were related.
It was like, ha ha, I know you're here. I can still do it.
Despite working night and day, police appear no closer to capturing this elusive predator.
Many times, I would get up out of bed, come to Homestead, hide in an alley, sit in a car, sit on the side of the road, hoping that I would see something.
The police were passing out boat horns for the women, 200 of them in fact, so that they could blow a horn at least and have the police come, because they were loud horns. They were advising people to buy dogs.
We were doing everything humanly possible.
The residents were living in a lockdown fear. It wasn't a community that has whole house air conditioning. It was hot. It was summertime. It was blazing hot. They couldn't open a window and put a fan in the window for fear that someone would crawl through that window.
They lived in jail while the perpetrator was probably walking around watching us. And we had to catch this guy.
I was riding up the hill and I saw this elderly lady that I knew carrying some grocery bags up the hill. And I stopped and I said, come on, get in, I'll ride you home. It's just too hot. And you shouldn't be walking this hot day, you know. It gave her a little bit of hell. And when they dropped her off at her house, I personally had said to her, check your windows and just be careful. And she says, okay, you know. I just walked into the station, and Chief Kelly said, we had another rape yesterday. And I said, oh, man, like, who was it? And he mentioned the name, and it was a lady that I had taken up the hill.
Despite the mayor's warning, on August 25th, the 76-year-old lady became the 7th victim. It was 2 months after the 6th attack, but this time the violence has escalated to a dangerous level. Fear has gripped Homestead, Pennsylvania. A serial rapist is preying on elderly women, and police seem powerless to stop him.
These are our people. We knew them.
Chased all our forensic leads down. We hit dead ends with those. The frustration that set in.
Psychic Nancy Meyer is helping with the investigation. She's certain, if not caught soon, the rapist will turn killer.
We were going to have a murder rather than a vicious assault.
At the scene of the last rape, they had found a large knife on the steps of her home that he had threatened to cut her throat if she didn't stop fighting.
We were convinced 100% that we were dealing with somebody that we knew and that was just getting off, watching us.
But it was, again, looking for that proverbial needle in a haystack. He wasn't going to appear to be public enemy number one. He was going to appear to be a nice young man.
With the investigation hitting a wall, Detective Hobart again contacts the psychic.
After the last victim, Nancy and I spoke again. I was eating, sleeping, and drinking this case, along with other officers. I wasn't the only officer doing that. I'm sure that my frustrations of being unable to locate this guy were starting to show.
And I said, Tommy, you're going to have him by next week. It's going to be over with. You're going to arrest him. You won't need me anymore. I'll believe that when I see it. And but he said, gee, I hope you're right. I said, I hope I'm right. I hope this nightmare's over with.
And then, the break the entire town has been waiting for.
None of our victims had anything ever taken from them until our last victim.
One of those items was a shotgun.
The phone rang, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a guy I know, and he said, I know who you're hunting for. I said, come on. They took a shotgun last night, didn't they? We never publicized that. Never. And he said, it's over Steel City Arms over in Braddock. The guy's trying to sell it. I can set it up for you.
The informant sets up the buy, and the police, armed with the psychic sketch, stake out the pawn shop and wait. When the suspect arrives and takes back possession of the gun, the police are there to arrest him.
And I had the sketch sitting next to me on the seat. And he turned and kind of looked at me. I said, this was like a photograph of this guy. And of course, at the time, my belief in psychics went sky high.
When he did return and when he did take back custody of the shotgun, they were there to arrest him on a charge of receiving stolen property. And to this point, they didn't have his fingerprints.
We brought him into the police department, Mirandized him, his rights, rolled his fingerprints. We had a district attorney there advising us to make sure that every move we made was calculated, that there's not going to be any mistakes. This man is going to go to trial. There's not going to be any motions to suppress. There's not going to be any technicalities to walk on.
We called a fingerprint expert. When he compared the prints, he just looked up and said, gentlemen, it's over.
You would have thought everybody in the room would have been high-fiving or yelling or screaming. Wasn't a sound in the room.
Matched the fingerprints, and all the forensic evidence on down the line matched.
After 4 years and 7 vicious attacks, the man arrested is 22-year-old Dennis Foy. Unemployed, Foy lived with his parents on the same block where one of the rapes occurred.
Foy's arrest in the fall of 1987 came after his case received not only local but national publicity.
I think my feeling is for the victims, and they're through it, and so am I.
Thank God that these women that were raped were heroes enough to go to court.
You saw 3 widows and a woman who had never married, who had told police she in fact had been a virgin, a 76-year-old woman, had to testify in detail.
A year later at his trial, Foy faced the women he violated. In court, the jury hear the intimate details of Foy's trail of terror. He knew his victims and staked out their homes, waiting for his chance. He broke in by scaling the side of a house and entering through a second-floor window. Inside, he attacked the defenseless women and stifled their cries for help with a pillow or whatever else was nearby. Sometimes he tied their feet and hands. He threatened his final victim with a knife. The judge described his acts as unspeakable. Foy is convicted on all counts and receives 100 years in maximum security prison. With no inside knowledge, how could psychic Nancy Meyer have known so much about this case? She knew the attacker was African American, lived in the neighborhood, and knew his victims. Through her psychic ranging, she described how he entered each home through the second-story window, and she correctly predicted when the investigation would be over. And what about that hat? When Dennis Foy was arrested, he wore a hat eerily similar to the one Nancy had the sketch artist draw.
If you're gonna put a hat on somebody, you put a hat on, whatever. But she wanted it tilted a certain way. She wanted it to be, to cover a certain part, you know, the head. The things that amazed me is she hit so many things right. And the last thing was the hat. She just hit, the hat was just, it was there. It was the way she described it and painstakingly described it.
Today, Homestead, Pennsylvania is bouncing back from economic downturn.
We haven't bounced back to where we should be, but we had a developer that bought the U.S. Steel property. Right now it's called the Waterfront.
But no one can forget those 5 years when one man held an entire community hostage.
You know, these acts affect a lot of people. Thank goodness they caught him. Who knows what the next step might have been.
You'll never lose that feeling, you know. You'll never lose the feeling that you could have done more for these people.
Just to do it for fun, I don't think so. It's not fun ranging assaults like that. There's nothing fun about it. But when it gets results, then it's worth it.
She said we would have them, and it wasn't shortly thereafter that we did. So, you explain it.
In 1987, when 2 teenage girls are murdered in Thunder Bay, Canada, the police fear the worst.
I immediately thought that we had a serial killer working the area.
Police think they've got their man, but a psychic says they're wrong.
I felt terrible, but I had to tell him I'm having trouble recognizing the face I see.
In the public's mind, it was going to be sort of a miracle if anybody was caught because so much time had elapsed.
Then, 13 years later, a stone-cold case comes back to life. Was the psychic right all along?
I knew I had seen that face so clearly.
On the shores of Lake Superior sits Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. In the 1600s, a fur trading post. Today, a struggling industrial town. On Sunday, May 10th, 1987, Mother's Day, an elderly couple out on their morning walk discover the body of a young woman laying in a gravel pit. First to arrive on the scene is Constable Jerry Moran of the Ontario Provincial Police.
The body was located right in this area here. The top had been pulled up and her jeans were undone. Her shoes were removed and laid beside the body.
Police comb the scene and find a plastic bag containing a beer bottle and what appears to be the undergarments of their victim.
The thing that was going through my mind at the time was
somebody's Mother's Day had been ruined for the rest of their lives.
But Detective Moran has a job to do and puts his personal feelings aside.
You treat it very businesslike. You're detached. Any short-lived evidence, anything that weather could destroy, we have to try to preserve that as fast as possible.
At the scene, police also find shoe prints and tire marks. The young woman is identified as 17-year-old high school student Donna Tebenham.
The body of 17-year-old Donna Tebenham was found yesterday afternoon in a gravel pit north of the city. As for details, that's about all the OPP is releasing so far.
The circumstances surrounding it dictates that we are or have forwarded the body to the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto for expert examination.
Donna Tebenham was your typical 16-year-old girl. You know, she went to school, she had friends.
Julio Gomes is a local journalist for the Thunder Bay Chronicle.
I've lived all my life in Thunder Bay, and at the time I was a teenager as well. And I know my own feeling was one of shock.
An autopsy reveals she died of asphyxiation. There were small traces of alcohol in her body, but no drugs. A sample of semen is also recovered. Another curious clue. Tiny specks of blue paint were lifted from her clothing.
The blue paint was at one point used on a specific year of pickup trucks. Anybody that wanted to paint their vehicle could have painted it that blue, but we had established based on the wheelbase and the axle width that it was a truck.
Police learned that Donna had spent the previous evening visiting friends. She was last seen walking back from a local corner store at about 11 p.m. Calls from the public kept police busy, but brought them no closer to a suspect.
We had so many suspects, or what could be considered persons of interest, but as it turned out, in all the cases, it was a dead end. People would come forward and just say that they have reason to suspect this person because they said something. They said they may have seen this girl at a party, or they said that they went to school with this girl and they've done things to this girl and things like that. They were blowhards at a party, most of them, that would just want to get attention for themselves and admit to doing anything. And all these guys were subsequently ruled out as suspects.
Another snag. Partial fingerprints found on the beer bottle at the scene turn up no matches. With no suspects, and with no DNA testing in 1987, the semen sample sat on the shelf. The most promising clue police had appeared to be the blue repaint chips found on the body, but record-keeping back then was less exact. Tracking down a blue repainted truck had to be done by sight.
In this particular case, we were looking for a travel or an international travel truck. It's like an old Chevy Suburban. So there weren't too many of them around. So we were tracking those things down, and we spent months looking for everybody that was registered or that ever owned one of those. And so that's all time-consuming.
Thunder Bay is a small town, and there are unfortunately a lot of other unsolved murders that take place, and every couple of years you'd have someone that disappears and they're never found.
Then, Friday, August 7th, another body is spotted off the side of the road just a few miles from where Donna Tebenham was murdered 3 months earlier. The second victim is another Thunder Bay High School student, 16-year-old Bernadette LeClaire.
We were supposed to go dancing. I didn't hear from her. I knew something was wrong.
David Binquist was Bernadette LeClaire's boyfriend at the time she went missing.
And I just happened to be flipping through the newspaper, and they had a little article about a native girl found in the power lines. My heart almost jumped out of my chest.
The crime scene appears chillingly familiar to Constable Moran.
The victims were the same age. There was no obvious signs of violent death, but there was a plastic bag put over her head.
Shoe prints and tire tracks match the Donna Tebenham scene. Police also make another key discovery.
We found blue repaint chips on both bodies. I immediately thought that we had a serial killer working the area.
Then police get a promising lead. A woman walks into the station and says she knows who the killer is. She claims her boyfriend, who we will call Ron Newman, picked up a woman at the same corner store where Donna Tebenham was last seen the night she went missing.
She was allegedly an eyewitness to the actual apprehension.
So the police questioned him, and then they arrested him. And he was charged with 2 counts of murder.
Attorney Lee Begg had been working on Ron Newman's case since the day the arrest was made. Police fingerprint Newman, but the prints don't match, and he doesn't drive a blue truck. But police aren't giving up so easily.
We couldn't rule him out as a suspect just due to the fact that his prints didn't match what was found at our scene. He could have been wearing gloves. He could very well not have touched anything.
Nobody minds defending a guilty person, but when it's an innocent person, the task becomes so much more serious because you dare not make a mistake.
And police would learn that they had made a big one. At a preliminary hearing, the OPP's case against Ron Newman falls apart.
Well, she just didn't withstand cross-examination to the extent that the Crown had absolutely nothing to go on. There was no connection between my client and the murders whatsoever.
Finally, after spending 6 months in jail, the charges are dropped.
He was released, but unhappily for him, there was no one else to point the finger at.
We weren't defeated. We were still interested in pursuing the case, albeit from a different angle.
That different angle was a psychic.
One evening I was watching a documentary that involved a woman by the name of Noreen Rainier.
The use of psychics in police investigations is commonplace, but in Canada, almost unheard of. Will the psychic lead the OPP to a brutal serial killer?
I saw so clearly the face of the murderer.
In Thunder Bay, Ontario, the murder of 2 teenage girls has the city demanding answers. Police have a suspect, but not enough evidence to convict. Desperate for clues, a cop calls a psychic.
She had been successful with several American agencies, so I thought we had nothing to lose.
Noreen Rainier is a psychometrist who specializes in missing persons and homicide cases.
I like touching something off the victims, and metal is better for me. It seems to be a better conduit. It holds the energy or images of what that individual saw just before he or she was killed.
Detective Moran sends her a pair of earrings found on Donna Tebenham, as well as a necklace from Bernadette LeClaire.
When I first start a case, I have to prove to the police that I'm real. And so I always tell them a few things they already know, usually how the person was killed, what he or she looked like, or when they were alive, a few things like that to gain their confidence in me as a credible psychic. And then they can ask questions, and my mind just sees what they ask.
Yeah, I felt a little weird about the whole thing. I'd never been involved with a psychic. I'd never even been to a tea reader, but I figured, if it works, who am I to argue with it?
Like most of her cases, Noreen conducts her reading with Moran over the phone.
When I held Donna's earring, I remember seeing her sort of light brownish hair, and I feel she had problems with her S's. I see braces.
She described the victims very accurately, right down to the speech impediment on Tebenham and the character of LeClaire.
I had Bernadette's necklace, so it wasn't that difficult to be able to describe her. I felt more fuller lips. I felt more feisty, confident, a little bit rebellious, again young.
Then Noreen astounds Moran by describing the murder.
Remember, I couldn't breathe. Screaming. I'm having trouble breathing. Didn't feel any knives or guns or wounds of that sort, just not breathing.
It started, being a little unusual that she would know some of this stuff, and I certainly wasn't given this information to her.
Again, I closed my eyes, and I could feel, first of all, I felt a truck. And it was blue, it was low, and it had sort of a flat thing in the back of it.
I was somewhat surprised because that's the color of the vehicle we were looking for, based on the paint chips found in both scenes.
The eyes. I'm seeing the eyes now. On a face, when I close my eyes and I'm trying to describe the murderer, I don't see the whole face at one time.
But the whole face is what the police need, so Noreen sets up a circle group hoping to get a clearer picture of the killer.
I'm seeing an eye. A circle group is people with like minds. We're all hopefully trying to get the same answers. I was teaching at the time an ESP course, and some of my students had heard about the case that I was working on, and they wanted to become involved in it and help me see more. Large ears, more closer to the head. It was so clear. I saw it so clearly. I knew that if I had my artist draw it, that we would have a face for Constable Moran.
She subsequently got a hold of a sergeant from an American police force that had worked with her before, and based on her description, he drew a composite sketch of what she thought our suspect should look like.
Length. There was just a small space between the upper lip and the nose. I made a photostat copy of the sketch and sent it to Constable Moran and waited to hear what he had to say.
When I got the Polaroid picture of the composite sketch, it didn't look like anybody in particular that we had looked at.
Nothing. They didn't know who it was. I was devastated. I felt so like I was on, and he didn't know who my face was. I was just totally devastated.
It looks like another dead end, but Moran is not willing to give up just yet. He sends the psychic a stack of photos, including the photo of Ron Newman.
I didn't really recognize anyone in the lineup. I felt terrible, but I had to tell him I'm having trouble recognizing the face I see.
At that point, I was somewhat disappointed, but I knew that there was no point in pursuing something that wasn't there.
But before the cop gives up on the psychic, he has one more question.
Will we get him, and when will we arrest him? And I said, yes, he's going to be 32 years old. He's going to have a mustache. And I saw the initial R. I didn't know if it was first or last name, but I saw R.
Moran is stumped by Noreen's clues. Ron Newman was 32 years old, and he had the letter R in his name, but the psychic sketch looks nothing like him.
The description that she made, really, it was a stretch to make it fit Newman.
The last conversation I had with Constable Moran was when he sent me the lineup of the faces, and that was the last time we spoke.
At that point, the case didn't go very much further. I was taken from the case and put back on general duties because there was no other avenues of investigation to pursue.
I questioned my ability. How could I see so clearly and it be so wrong? What was wrong? My mind, what was happening?
The case goes cold. 2 16-year-olds are dead and their killer is still out there. Police run occasional Crime Stoppers television spots, but no new leads surface.
It always seemed like they were at a dead end, and that really in the public's mind, it was going to be sort of a miracle if anybody was caught because so much time had elapsed.
In fact, 13 years go by. Then science steps in and reignites a cold case and confirms a psychic's long-forgotten vision.
How could I be so wrong when I had seen so clearly?
In Thunder Bay, Ontario, the murder of 2 teenage girls remains unsolved. 13 years pass, and then a breakthrough in fingerprinting technology offers new hope to cold cases. In August of 2000, an automated fingerprint identification system known as AFIS was upgraded to search and retrieve both finger and palm prints of convicted felons.
This led to numerous cases being cleared up, and one of them was the Tevin M. LeClaire case.
Partial prints found on a beer bottle and a plastic bag at the scenes could now be compared against pools of fingerprint records. AFIS turns up a hit, and the owner of the prints is Larry Runholm. In 1990, 3 years after the murders, Larry Runholm, a native of Thunder Bay, had been arrested and charged with drinking and driving. His fingerprints were forwarded to the RCMP and remained on file for 10 years, until the new technology made the match. A case that has baffled cops for 13 years is finally solved. On July 11th, 2000, Runholm is charged with the murders of Donna Tebenham and Bernadette LeClaire.
It was a huge story when he was arrested because the community had almost forgotten about these deaths, and the few people that still remember it had almost given up any hope that anyone would ever be arrested and held to account for it.
The arrest finally vindicated a psychic who 13 years earlier accurately described both girls, their dark hair, Donna's braces, and Bernadette's feisty personality. She even envisioned their deaths.
I'm having trouble breathing.
But it was her sketch of the killer that police turned a blind eye 2 years ago that now came back to haunt them.
The profile provided by Noreen Rainier regarding a suspect turned out was amazingly accurate. At the time of the murders, Mr. Runholm was only 19. We have a high school photograph, Mr. Runholm. The prominent nose, the full mouth, the length of the hair.
Other puzzling clues offered by the psychic now seemed to make sense as well.
I remember Constable Moran saying, "Will we get him, and when will we arrest him?" And I said, yes, he's going to be 32 years old. He's going to have a mustache. And I saw the initial R. I didn't know if it was first or last name, but I saw R. So I was overjoyed that my information was right. Sad that it didn't help in a timely manner.
Runholm admits to intentionally killing both girls and avoids a jury trial by pleading guilty to second-degree murder.
And Larry Runholm never took the stand, never explained anything. His lawyer said he has no memory of what happened, so he has nothing to offer.
Runholm claims he can't remember what happened back in 1987 when the girls, both 16, were believed to have been raped and then suffocated 3 months apart. But Justice Stanley Carisco, in his sentencing address, says he saw no evidence of amnesia, and he says the families deserve an explanation for these sickening murders.
You know, the guy is a vicious killer, sadistic, and the judge saw through him, and I'm very thankful for that.
To this day, the police don't know exactly what happened the nights the two girls went missing. What they do know is that both girls were suffocated with a plastic bag. DNA testing of semen taken from both girls matched Larry Runholm, and blue paint chips found on both girls matched the paint and make of the truck he drove.
Why did he do it? And how could he live with himself for the next 15 years, where ostensibly he was raising a family and leading a normal life? It's one of those just baffling things that you constantly think about and say, you know, what really happened?
His plea of second-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence.
The ruling of 20 years came as some satisfaction and closure for the families of the victims.
Second-degree murder for two girls, I would have liked to have seen, 22, if not a little bit more. But I am pleased it's over.
There was a certain amount of uncertainty that we had stepping in here today and just wondering where the judge was going to end up. So at 20 years, I think my sister was well served.
Look at how many lives he's destroyed. I don't think he got what he deserves. But I know he'll get what he deserves where he's going.
If the police had used the psychic's sketch in their investigation, would the murders have been solved sooner? An article published a few weeks after Runholm's arrest revealed that police did have him in their sights, but he was somehow overlooked.
He had lived on a road with his parents, and his parents were away all summer at a tourist camp, which they ran. And so he had the run of the house, came and went as he pleased. His house was on the same route that myself and my partner did a door-to-door knock on. And as it happens that the one side of the road that my partner was on was the same house that Mr. Runholm lived in. And he wasn't home the two times that we went there. But we had, at that point, we had no reason to suspect Mr. Runholm of anything. He was just another name to be cleared.
The police just using me is right, but they are not used to working with psychics, so they don't understand how we work and how they have to interpret our clues. It's not all factual the way in this reality. My goal, and still will be till it happens, is to train and teach the detectives how to do what I can do.
In hindsight, the clues that Miss Rainier provided, although we were disappointed that we weren't able to successfully charge suspect number one, it did prove to be very accurate for suspect number two, although 13 years down the road. I'm glad I used the psychic because it sort of opens up a whole new avenue of investigation. We had nothing to lose by using her and everything to gain.
How dare I had doubted my own psychic ability. So, yes, I was joyful and knowing that my ability was working and does work. And again, like faith, don't doubt, believe.
When a 42-year-old nurse is found bludgeoned to death, a small town in New Jersey is in shock.
It was a vicious attack.
Her hands were bound with an extension cord.
A minimum of 21 hits in the head.
I didn't have my mother to raise me anymore.
Police suspect her boyfriend, but a psychic says the killer is someone else.
I saw a man, saw a hammer, a tied-up woman in her bed.
Can a psychic's vision solve the mystery of who killed Betty Cornish?
The killer lives upstairs.
Belvedere, New Jersey, an hour away from New York City, but a million miles away from big city crime, a town where neighbors trust each other and doors are seldom locked.
It's a very quiet town. Everybody knows everyone. It's just one of those small communities.
Basically a little rural town that hadn't really changed over the decades.
Until August 8th, 1987. A frantic emergency call comes in from a man who says he's found his girlfriend dead. Kent Swigert, now chief of Belvedere Police, is the first on the scene.
I entered the apartment and observed a male standing in the living room. And this male said to me, "Is she dead?" So I walked into the bedroom and I observed a female lying face up in the bed. It was pretty obvious that she was killed.
The crime is so horrific that the Belvedere Police need help. Dave Heater of the Warren County Prosecutor's Office is assigned to the case.
It was a vicious attack. We had a minimum of 21 hits in the head. There was blood spattered 360 degrees on all four walls, the ceiling. There was blood pooled on the floor.
She was laying face up, her arms were behind her back, her hands were bound with an extension cord.
Her nightshirt was pulled up over her head.
Totally blood-soaked, along with the sheet around about her head that was also blood-soaked.
There was exposed bone, and extreme damage to the forehead.
The victim is 42-year-old Betty Cornish, a divorced mother with 5 grown daughters. She worked as a practical nurse.
She was a good mom. She liked to go out dancing, and she had a big circle of friends that she would go out with.
She had recently moved back to Belvedere to be closer to her family.
It was something I just couldn't believe. I was like, what do you mean, you know? What do you mean my sister's dead?
So vicious was the attack that at first police think she was killed by gunfire.
My sister Mary Beth called. She just said something happened and that they thought she was shot.
And I know I started going crazy that I wanted to go with her because I knew they were going to take her body to Newark for an autopsy. And I just kept saying, she's going to be alone, she's going to be alone, I want to be with her.
The autopsy report shows that Betty Cornish died of blunt force injuries consistent with a hammer attack.
When we started to find out from the autopsy reports that the claw end of the hammer was used and that it penetrated into the skull, it was gruesome.
This was an angry person. Whether it came as a result of a fight, whether the victim had fought with him, he was mad, angry at something, and he took it out on the victim.
The murder was so violent that the police assume Betty's neighbors must have heard something.
We're having a very difficult time. We're not getting anyone within the apartment complex that's giving us anything. There were no screams. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing unusual.
And apart from the vicious attack to the victim, there is nothing unusual in the apartment except for blood in the bathroom.
We found blood in the bathroom, and we found blood around the sink and also on the mirrors. We had made the assumption that our suspect had probably cleaned up there.
At first, it looks as if the killer came through the window, because the victim's window was removed and found leaning against the building. But a fingerprint found on the glass tells the police a very different story.
That fingerprint would have had to have been someone from the inside grabbing the window. The idea that if someone did jump in, they would have to grab a hold of the sill in order to pull themselves in. There would have had to been striations across that wooden sill from the body sliding across. There were no striations.
That leads police to believe Betty Cornish knew her killer.
We believe that that window was removed to draw us off because he was located so close to the victim.
So the police zero in on her boyfriend.
He found the body, he reported the crime. When we began to question him, he indicated that he had been out fishing that day. Some of the other investigators who were going around the apartment came in to us to tell us that they found a set of clippers that a fisherman would typically use was located directly below the bedroom window of the victim. That became very suspicious to us because he said he had been fishing.
It was shocking, but I kind of thought that maybe it was the boyfriend because I didn't know Paul that well.
Could he be the one who removed the window?
We started questioning her boyfriend more and more, and honestly, I believe he got scared.
Before police can further question him, he stops talking.
He asked for an attorney at the time. So we couldn't talk to him any further, and his attorney advised him not to speak with us or cooperate with us at any point.
Now, after 3 days and no hard leads, the people in town are uneasy.
This was the first murder that Belvedere had experienced in really 80 to 100 years. The people in the immediate area of Blair House Apartments were very, very scared at the time. There was a crowd of people that had watched what was going on, and there was fear that there might be more people in danger.
Everything, my whole complete life changed overnight. I didn't have a place to live anymore. I didn't have my mother to raise me anymore. Nothing's ever normal again.
Residents in the apartment complex, eager to help the police, volunteer for polygraph tests, and they all pass. It seems as if the police have hit a wall.
The longer that a case goes on, your chances lessen greatly by the hour. That starts to scare you. There is a killer in the community, and you don't know where he is.
You imagine a monster. Only a monster could do something like that, and that's what we were afraid of. What kind of crazy person that could be out there?
I just wanted this person caught yesterday, you know. I remember calling the prosecutor's office. Did they find him yet? Did they find this person that killed my sister yet? That's when someone had told me about Nancy.
Nancy Weber is a psychic who claims to be able to see what most of us cannot.
It's not always in picture form. Sometimes it's sound, sometimes it's smells, sometimes it's vision, sometimes it's a feel, a fabric.
8 days after her sister's murder, Peggy calls psychic Nancy Weber and sets up a meeting.
And she didn't want to know anything. Nancy didn't want to know anything. And she took me into this room and we began to talk.
I felt this horrible, heartbreaking misery.
Without any knowledge of the case, the psychic claims to tune in to Peggy's loss.
Somehow that connected inside me with she had sustained a great and tragic loss of a family member. She had a sister who was murdered.
And then she says something amazing.
I said to her that the chief suspect is a boyfriend. She said, yes. I said, he is not the killer.
But can the psychic see who the real killer is?
I saw a hammer. I saw a tied-up woman in her bed. I saw her brutally murdered. And I thought, that's the killer.
In Belvedere, New Jersey, it's been 8 days since 42-year-old Betty Cornish was found bludgeoned to death in her bed.
There is a killer in the community, and you don't know where he is.
Her boyfriend, who found the body, isn't talking, and the police have few hard leads.
I just wanted this person caught yesterday, you know.
Desperate to find the killer, the victim's sister asks a psychic for help, and the psychic has a vision of the murder, a vision so horrific she feels she can only share it with the police.
I asked her to please contact the police involved. I said, let them speak with me, not you.
I received a call from Peggy Goebel. She told me that she had been talking to a woman who was a psychic. I'm skeptical, you know, when a psychic calls up or says that they have psychic ability. I want to hear who it is and what they have to say before I'm going to put a lot of faith into that individual.
But in this case, it's Nancy Weber.
So I said, okay, now I'm listening.
The detective and the psychic have worked together before on other cases.
I would be more than happy to bring her to the scene and get her thoughts, her feelings on what occurred here, because we're now beginning to get into a week into this case and we're getting nowhere.
No sooner do the detective and the psychic arrive at the scene than Nancy has a vision that will turn the investigation upside down.
I looked upstairs and I saw a shadow. And I thought, that's the killer. He was going upstairs. He lives there. I pointed upstairs and said, the killer lives upstairs. I said, his first name's John, and last initial R.
She gave me the name John, and she gave me the initials JR.
The man upstairs is 30-year-old John Reese, a farm laborer who lives with his girlfriend and her 2 children.
He operated a piece of heavy equipment at the sod farm, just a working-class individual.
And I said, well, I'm not real sure that's the right guy, Nancy. He already passed a polygraph.
Not only has John Reese passed a polygraph, but he has an alibi for the time police think Betty was murdered.
Based on what the condition of the body and what we knew at that time, we were guessing that the time of death would have been somewhere around midnight. John Reese was able to tell us pretty specifically where he was during the entire day, right up until the point of about 2 o'clock in the morning, and at that point he went to bed. He alibied himself pretty well.
I said, that doesn't matter. It was such a strong feeling and strong vision.
At that point in my mind, I was beyond Mr. Reese. He passed a polygraph. She said that she didn't care, that, you know, polygraph him again, do what you have to do, but he's the guy.
Next, Detective Heater takes the psychic inside Betty Cornish's bedroom.
Crime scene hadn't been cleaned up. There was still blood spattered around. was scary to walk in and not know what lay there.
As Nancy stands beside the victim's bed, she is hit with another vision.
Ben, I got the time of about 1:30 a.m. roughly.
Her vision puts the time of death much later than what the police say.
And this was one of the few times Dave actually responded to me and said, no, it was earlier. I said, no, wrong, because I had a very strong impression of a time, and I had a very strong impression of a murderer.
Could the psychic be right? Could the killer be John Reese?
She made me think more. Like, I knew he was a suspect, but I was a suspect. Everybody was. So when she kept pushing it is when I started to believe it. They found it.
Past the polygraph, she knew that he still did it.
He was there when the police arrived. He was there when the detectives arrived. He was there when they removed the body. And he was just there. Every time someone would look, there was John Reese.
It's the psychic's final vision that turns the investigation on its head.
I see this blur of a metallic buckle that I am told in my mind is a Western belt buckle that has meaning and value to John Reese.
Heater sends an investigator to see if Nancy is right.
Reese, in fact, had the belt buckle and was very consistent with everything that Nancy had described.
With this new piece of information, Detective Heater goes out on a limb and takes a second look at the man upstairs.
I, as a supervisor, at least now at this point, had some kind of justification in my own mind for spending man hours on a man who already passed a polygraph.
He decides to take a gamble on a psychic's vision.
My boss basically told me I was crazy.
Heater sends detectives to question Reese again.
Reese was very comfortable with these two detectives and was willing to talk to them every day. They became almost like friends. And because of that investigative bond, Reese started talking about more things.
Detective Tom Trainer was one of the officers investigating Reese.
He gave information that caused us to believe that he might have been in the victim's apartment. It wasn't a real credible account of how or why he was in there, and of course, meanwhile, one of our ID men had developed, the latent prints off the front window.
11 days after the murder, the first solid piece of damning evidence. The fingerprint belongs to John Reese.
Trainer went after Reese again and told him, look, we've got your fingerprint on the window. What's the story? Oh, well, we're friends, Betty and I would come down there and, the window would get stuck. So, I would help her unjam the window to get it closed.
John Reese said that he was there to fix the window, and the window never got stuck. We had to put a stick underneath it to hold it up because it wouldn't stay stuck.
Another break. The medical examiner revises the time of death. Betty Cornish didn't die at midnight as the police thought. She died much later.
We got results back from the medical examiner's office, which gave us a time of death more into the early morning hours.
Just as the psychic told police at a time when Reese has no alibi.
The biggest problem that we had was the time period in the 3 o'clock to 3:30 in the morning area. We felt that there was something he was holding back.
We had his fingerprint from inside the apartment. We knew that he was lying to us at this point in time.
But the police have to make a case that will stand up in court. They need the murder weapon. Can the psychic help?
I saw a swamp, and so I told him, this is where you'll find the hammer.
Thanks to a psychic's vision. Police in Belvedere, New Jersey now have a prime suspect in the brutal killing of a 42-year-old nurse.
I pointed upstairs and said, the killer lives upstairs.
But they don't have enough hard evidence to arrest him. They need the murder weapon, and the psychic claims she knows where it is.
Suddenly saw this small body of messy, muddy water and the hammer falling into it. I thought, he dropped it in there.
Nancy When she returned to our office, she drew us a map.
Took a piece of paper and drew my crude map and handed it to them and said, this is where you'll find the hammer.
She gave us a road, she gave us a patch that she said were woods, and she said, and over in this corner is water. And she said, I see Reese throwing the hammer into the woods.
But she can't tell the police where that water is located. At the same time, detectives continue to badger their prime suspect, determined to find cracks in his story.
He was able to give detailed information about, when he made the coffee, when he got up in the morning to go to work, and what time he left for work. But then the time when we felt that the victim was murdered was a time that he didn't recall. He just breezed right over it.
Reese started talking about more things. And those things that he kept adding into his statement during the times was things that were off, that were not talked about before.
There's a lot of little things that he changes in his behavior between, deep breaths. You could tell something is bothering him. And we just felt at that point that he was ready to tell us something.
Detectives make their move. They bring Reese in.
We hit him with all the things that we knew, walked around the table, sat down next to him, looked him in the eye, and said, John, we know you did it, and you know you did it. Now why don't you tell us about it? Approximately 20 to 25 minutes, perhaps half an hour later, Detective Traynor came out of that room and advised us that he had confessed to the murder.
I believe he knew that we knew that he was the killer, and for some reason he had to share that with us. It's hard to picture why or how, but something made him realize that, it was wrong and that he had to trust us and that he did it and he had to admit that.
There was a hammer on the floor that I picked up, and I hit her once in the head with it. I hit her 2, 3, 4 times with the hammer. Large amount of blood flowed on the bed, some on the walls. And I went upstairs. Garbage bag. Washed up my hands and everything. Had another beer and went to bed.
Later, he told the police he dumped the hammer at the farm where he works.
When we did the search through the woods and we came out, there was the water in front of us. Water where Nancy said there would be water. We went in, we recovered the hammer, photographed it, brought it out, bagged it, tagged it, and put it into evidence.
18 days after beating Betty Cornish to death, John Reese is charged with her murder.
And I remember just my mother and father and I embracing and jumping up and down, happy that they caught him. But realizing that it just wouldn't bring her back.
Despite the confession, Reese later pleads not guilty. At the trial, his lawyers suggest Betty Cornish invited Reese into her apartment.
It was very hard because we would have to sit and see the murderer there every day.
A lot of the time, Mr. Reese basically propped his head on his hand and just seemed somewhat disinterested for the most part. He didn't want to show any expression to the jury, so he just basically sat like he was bored.
And he would, constantly turn his head and look at us. I remember my mother being there, and she was crying. It was hard for her to hold back her cries, and they wanted to put her out of the room. They didn't want the jurors to see my mother crying because it would sway their decision.
The jury doesn't believe John Reese's story. What they do believe is that sometime around 3 a.m., Reese came downstairs and snuck into Betty Cornish's apartment, bound her wrists with an extension cord, sexually assaulted her, and beat her to death, striking her at least 21 times with a hammer. After a 5-week trial, Reese is found guilty of all 11 charges, including first-degree murder. He is sentenced to 110 years.
I would like him to say he was sorry. I would like him to show some remorse because he never has.
I think that if he were to say anything, that he would try to hurt us in some way because he is sick enough He got 2 life sentences. He's eligible for parole in 45 years. So that means that he will be 72.
Or dead.
Or dead. And we will fight so that he dies in prison.
Why was the psychic so convinced that it was the man upstairs who killed Betty Cornish? He had already passed a lie detector test, yet she remained adamant her vision was correct. She knew his initials were J.R. and his first name was John. She also knew that he wore a large Western-style belt buckle. She even directed the police toward the murder weapon.
Nancy was probably one of the driving forces that kept me going back to Reese. I was willing to give him up, but she was very insistent.
Any constructive thing I can do assists Elizabeth and her soul and assists her family.
And whether you want to call it spiritual matter, whatever it is that a psychic sees, you've got to be able to believe in it. There's science, there may be the supernatural. I don't know how to explain what a psychic does, how they do it. All I know is it works.
When a woman's body washes up on a Florida beach, no one is more shocked than the police.
I have never in my life seen anything like this before.
The Navy thinks her husband's best friend is the killer, but a psychic disagrees.
The man's innocent.
How many times can you say, it wasn't me, I didn't do anything?
A psychic connects with the dead.
He's going to kill him.
Will her message be enough to save an innocent man from life in prison? On the northeast coast of Florida, Jacksonville is home to the Mayport Naval Station, the 3rd largest U.S. naval base in the world.
We live in a large military town, and we had 2 aircraft carriers, and you could tell when they were out to sea, that was 10,000 people gone from your population.
On the morning of March 26, 1988, 2 fishermen make a grisly discovery. They find a body washed up on the Intercoastal Waterway.
They thought it was a dolphin. They thought it was a fish that had washed up on the beach.
Dave Archer is a detective with the Atlantic Beach Police. When he arrives at the scene, he immediately knows this is no simple drowning.
I could tell it was that of a white female. Her hands were tied behind her back with a fishing stringer. And I thought, okay, that's odd.
She's identified as 22-year-old Anita Lukander. She had been reported missing by her co-workers at the Navy base 9 days earlier.
She was in my duty section, and she didn't show up for work. And in the Navy, you show up for work.
Peter Johnstone was a co-worker and a close friend of the Lukanders. When he'd realized Anita was missing, and knowing her husband was away at sea, he and fellow workers began a citywide search.
I mean, everybody, we all gotten worried. I mean, even the Navy had gotten hold of her husband, Bill, who was, I believe, down in Guantanamo Bay at the time.
My chief brought me down to the chief's mess and actually spent about 4 hours with me talking and settling me down. And I won't forget that night.
The autopsy suggests Anita's body had been in the water for 9 days. She was gagged with a white T-shirt. She had been strangled and her body had been mutilated.
I said, do you think she was raped? And he said, I can't tell. I said, what do you mean you can't tell? He said, all that's been surgically removed. And I thought, what?
The medical examiner also notes that her left ear had been cut off.
I told my boss, I said, look, I am entirely out of my league on this one. I have never in my life seen anything like this before.
Because of the shocking nature of the crime, they call in both state and federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI.
And Atlantic Beach at the time was a small town, a small police force. I don't think they were used to homicide investigations. And honestly, I don't think it was really taken seriously until Anita's body was found.
When investigators initially searched the Lucander home, the front door was unlocked.
There was no sign of forced entry. Just looked like a normal apartment. I'm thinking we got another missing military wife. You know, she's probably took off with somebody, or who knows.
3 days later, Anita's truck was found parked at a local bar just 4 miles from the house. When Bill Lucander arrives home from sea, he notices right away that something is wrong. Some of his guns are missing from his cabinet. Police immediately check pawn shops in the area, and one dealer says someone tried to sell him the stolen guns. A composite sketch of the suspect is made, but it leads nowhere and is filed away.
We started out with everybody was a suspect. In fact, the insurance company called me and said, we're fixing to pay off on the Lucander case, but we want to know if the husband is a suspect, because if he is, we're not going to pay. And I told him, I said, lady, at this point, he's the only one that's not a suspect, and the reason he's not is because he was out of the country.
A month later, a bizarre discovery. A mailman finds Anita's wallet. Sitting on top of it, a cold glass of water. No fingerprints are found on the wallet or the glass.
We took that as like a sign saying, okay, you guys are getting cold. You're headed in the wrong direction. You need to go back the other way.
The next day, Anita's purse is discovered blocks away from the Lucander home and on the same street as Bill's best friend, Peter Johnstone. Friends say that Johnstone spent a lot of time at the Lucander home, especially when his good friend Bill was away at sea.
Well, when Bill was gone, yeah, I would hang out over there. It wasn't not hardly as much as I did when Bill was there.
To investigators, Johnstone is beginning to look suspicious.
Every time you turn around, bam, Peter Johnstone standing right there looking at you. How's it going, guys? Is there anything I could do for you? No, we're on an active homicide investigation right now. There's nothing you can do for us, unless you did it.
Peter takes 2 polygraph tests. The first is inconclusive. The second one he passes.
I never felt concerned that they were investigating me. I never felt concerned with that. Always anything I could do to help.
Peter remains a suspect, but with no new witnesses, no physical evidence, the police don't have enough to make a case.
Everything was circumstantial. There was no smoking gun. There was no fingerprint to say, this is this and this is that. Just couldn't do it.
9 months after Anita was murdered, police are still no closer to catching her killer.
We pretty much hit a dead end.
The Anita Lucander case goes cold. 7 years pass without a single lead, and Anita's brutal killer is still out there.
Between 1988 and 1995, I was very frustrated, angry. I was still basically living and working with the same group of folks, and pretty much realized that, you know, there was probably somebody in that group that had killed Anita.
Then, in 1995, the Naval Criminal Investigation Services sets up a cold case unit, and the Anita Lucander case starts to warm up again. They go back to the original suspect list from 1989. At the top is Peter Johnstone, who is now married with 2 children and no longer in the Navy. 2 agents visit him in his home in Maryland.
You know, they just want to ask me a few questions, and the case had been brought back up. And just in a split second, it turned ugly, and they said, you did it. We know you did it. You're the one, and you better tell us now. And once again, I was just flabbergasted.
Investigators grilled Johnstone for a full 3 days. Now, in a dramatic turnaround, they believe they have the evidence they need to nail him. He's taken into custody and held for 30 days, until the Florida Duval County Grand Jury indicts the former Navy squadron member for the murder of Anita Lucander. Mimi Hannon, an investigator for the Public Defender's Office, is assigned the case.
We had a man that probably didn't commit this homicide, and it was our job to prove that.
For the defense, 7 years after the murder, it was going to be tough going. So breaking with convention, they turned to a psychic for help. But could a psychic's cryptic clues help save Peter Johnstone from life in prison? It's been 7 years since Anita Lucander's mutilated body washed up on the Intercoastal Waterway in Jacksonville, Florida. Her co-worker, former Navy Petty Officer Peter Johnstone, is charged with murdering his best friend's wife.
How many times can you say, it wasn't me, I didn't do anything?
There was no physical evidence really linking Peter to the crime. The only thing that linked him to Anita Lucander was his friendship with her, his business acquaintanceship with her, and, his friendship with her husband.
Ann Finnell and Pat McGinnis are Peter Johnstone's public defense lawyers.
Perhaps Peter Johnstone was an easy person to focus in on because he was cooperative with them.
The most damning evidence the Navy had was a supposed verbal confession given by Peter Johnstone during their 3-day interrogation of him in Maryland.
After I was arrested, I spent 30 days in Maryland jail awaiting paperwork from Florida because I was arrested under a fugitive from justice for murder. And when I got to Florida is when I met my attorney, Pat McGinnis, and they said that I had confessed. And what are you talking about? I didn't confess to anything. I kept telling them no for 2.5 days. And apparently they had this whole confession that they wrote up. Nothing I wrote up, nothing I signed, nothing I said, nothing.
The false confession that Peter ultimately gave was, basically, if I'd have done this, here's what I would have done.
Naval investigators contend that Peter Johnstone made advances to Anita, which she rejected. Angry, he strangles her, panics, and steals the guns from the cabinet to make it look like a burglary. He then dumps the guns and Anita Lucander's body off the bridge into the Intercoastal Waterway.
Most people don't believe that anyone would ever confess to something they didn't do. Those instances where interrogations last for long periods of time, the likelihood of a false confession is real. And in Peter Johnstone's case, this went on for 3 days.
Now it's up to the defense team to build a case for Peter Johnstone's innocence. Investigator Mimi Hannon's task is to go back 7 years to the original 1988 investigation.
Law enforcement in this case botched up an investigation tremendously. And it was a cold case. So you're going back and witnesses forget and people die and they move. And it's just really hard to reconstruct a real solid defense from something that happened so long ago.
To bolster their case, Hannon makes an unusual suggestion.
It occurred to me that law enforcement utilizes psychics. The government has utilized psychics. And back in the 90s, people weren't very forthcoming about using psychics to help them solve mysteries. When I first mentioned to Pat and Ann that I had a psychic friend and I would like to run the case by her and see if she had any feedback, they were very skeptical. Patrick almost did it, I felt, just to humor me. But I wasn't going to put my professional reputation on the line. I believed in Sharon's ability and was looking forward to using it.
Sharon Johns is a psychic who lives in Gainesville, Georgia. She says her psychic ability comes from a higher being.
I always pray to work from that highest level. And by doing that, the angels and the guides do come and stand with you because you're working in that light. I ask for extremely accurate information for those that I read for this day. When I get information, it just comes in words, just kind of quick words, or in a video, or just in kind of symbols.
Hannon and the psychic are friends, but they've never worked together until now.
I do all of my work over the phone because I prefer to be in my space. If I'm sitting beside a person, I have to move away from them. And I'm just more comfortable to do phone work. I don't care if the person lives next door. I'll say, no, call me on the phone. Because that way, my energy is more clear. Sure,
when Mimi calls Sharon Johns, she has no knowledge of the case and asks Mimi not to give her any.
She wanted to know the victim's name and date of birth and Peter's name and date of birth.
Peter
and that's all I gave her.
Immediately before she could even get his name out, I said, the man's innocent.
She told me that Peter would be found innocent and that the jury would come back in with an acquittal in March.
When I look at different aspects of what's going on, things just come immediately. With this case, it was just like a TV reel, just taking place.
Then Sharon inexplicably hones in on a curious clue.
I keep getting this about a composite somewhere. And you really need to see if somebody can find it.
How could Sharon know about the 7-year-old long-lost composite, the sketch of the man who tried to sell the stolen guns? And why does she think it's so significant?
The composite had not been found yet. We had so many volumes of discovery to go through that we intentionally had to start searching through the discovery boxes. And we eventually did find it. It was there, just as she said. I came back to the office the next morning, and Pat wanted to know what the psychic said. And his eyes got big as saucers.
There were views she had about the case and expressed that we were quite frankly puzzled as to how she could have arrived at those without a more intimate knowledge of the case than she had.
We had Pat's attention. He was going to take her more seriously than he had.
Sharon Johns was suggestive that this was, in fact, the person who was Anita Lukander's killer.
And the composite picture doesn't look anything like Peter Johnstone.
When I first saw the police sketch of the composite, I don't think it looked like me at all. One, I think the person had hair. And I'd like to show you some pictures of me back then. I haven't lost much hair since, in 20 years. And not to mention, I'm not wearing my glasses now, but back then I always wore glasses. So, without bumping into a wall, didn't look a lot like me at all.
As we began to work on the case and went further and further into things, then I saw more and more.
Patrick had asked me to ask Sharon a series of questions. He wanted them tape recorded so that it would be the exact words of Sharon Johns. During my conversation, her voice started to go from her own voice to the voice of somebody else.
As well as seeing visions, Sharon claims she is a channeler. It's a phenomena that allows spirits to communicate with the living.
It was really sort of a surprise to me, too, in that I wasn't really, what you're saying, preparing for this.
The voice was very high-pitched. It sounded like a little girl's voice. He's going to kill me. I don't know where Sharon went, but I was talking to somebody else.
Can a psychic channeling the voice of a dead woman help change the course of justice? A sailor accused of killing his best friend's wife is about to go on trial.
You did it. We know you did it. You gotta be kidding me.
When a psychic is asked to help on the case, she says he's innocent.
It's like I saw the whole thing just unfold, like a video.
And now, in one of her sessions, she claims to channel the voice of the murder victim, Anita Lukander.
She started talking in first person about the crime, and she walked me through the crime as it happened.
When I'm really into a trance channel, I am moved completely out of the way, to the point that I don't have any idea of what is being said. Mimi tells me that it was a high-pitched little voice. She sounded like a little child.
The voice sounded scared and frightened and had expressed that to me, that she was held for days, and he would leave her there alone for hours at a time, bound. And she knew that he was going to kill her. And I'll never forget the last words this voice said was, "And then it was done." And I took that to mean, and then he killed me. I'd never been a part of something like that before. So at that point, I went over to jail, and I pulled Peter out. And I said, Peter, what's did Anita sound like? And he said, you couldn't mistake in her voice. She sounded just like a little girl.
It's like she is the one that showed me herself in that chat that she was in. And by her coming through and actually speaking was amazing, in that the people that were listening to it heard it, but the recording didn't record it.
There was nothing on it but static, and there was a lot of distortion on the tape.
If the psychic's revelations are accurate, Anita was held captive for several days before being tossed into the waterway. And if this is true, the prosecution's contention that her body had been in the water 9 days must be false.
When we looked at the autopsy results and the photographs, both Mr. McGinnis and I were very suspicious of the body having been in the water for that full 9-day period. And the reason being is that in the intercoastal waterway, even in March, there's a lot of crab activity.
To prove their theory, the defense team order a crab test at the same location where Anita's body was found. In the experiment, raw chicken is used in place of human flesh and is placed at the bottom of the river for 9 days.
While that body is on the bottom especially, it would be attacked by crabs and other animals that are in the water as well. This body had none of that kind of activity.
If crabs didn't ravage Anita's body, it could only mean that she was not in the waterway for the full 9 days. This contradicts the Navy's contention that Peter killed Anita and dumped her body that same night. It makes the so-called confession meaningless and amazingly vindicates the word of a psychic. February 18th, 1997. Almost 9 years after Anita Lukander's brutal murder, Peter Johnstone goes on trial.
Peter was definitely fearful facing trial because he was looking at a life sentence. He'd been behind bars for almost 20 months by the time it had gone to trial.
But just as the trial gets underway, the psychic makes an unusual request.
Mimi called me and she says, is there anything else that we need to do? We're going to trial. I said, just be sure that you've got that composite. I said, it's very important. I don't know why, but you've got to take it.
We had no idea where she was going with that and what the significance would be.
Anne Fennell enters the composite sketch into evidence, and it will prove to be pivotal.
Trials don't always end up like you want them to end up. It is an incredible nerve-wracking experience, much more so than if you're going to trial with someone who you either know or think is guilty.
After a 3-week trial, the jury begins their deliberations. Just 2 hours in, the jury requests to see the composite sketch of the man who pawned the guns once again.
And we found out there was one holdout in that jury room who wanted to take a closer look at Peter Johnstone.
1 hour later, the jury reaches a verdict.
My heart was, coming out of my chest, and you're just sitting there, and the judge takes a piece of paper, and he reads it, and I'm like, okay. And then he folds it back up, and he hands it back.
It was a real nail-biter for a few minutes until the jury was seated, and the clerk read the verdict.
With the jury found the defendant not guilty.
A not guilty verdict in the death of his best friend's wife, Anita Lukander, who was raped, strangled, and mutilated in 1988. On March 17, 1997, just as the psychic predicted, Peter Johnstone walked out of the Jacksonville courtroom a free man. How did the psychic know so much? She said that the key to Peter's defense lay in the composite sketch. She predicted that he would be free in March, and she correctly predicted that Anita had not been thrown straight into the water after the murder, as the prosecution stated.
Sharon's contribution to the case had become huge. She invigorated the defense team. We were on a certain defense theories that was what Sharon was seeing too.
It got him looking at other avenues and justifying what she had said. It was great. So I think good chance she saved my life.
Today, 21 years after Anita Lukander was murdered, Sharon Johns and Peter Johnstone meet for the first time.
You look good. You look good. It has. Oh. It's so, you're welcome. You're welcome. Oh. Doing this work is a big responsibility. I have simply just learned to trust. And what I see, I give. I can't give them any more than what I see or what I hear.
To date, the cold-blooded killer of Anita Lukander has never been brought to justice.
She was my wife. She's a daughter. She was a sister, an aunt, and there's only really one person that knows what happened to Anita, and that person needs to come forward and put this to rest. And if he's not man enough to do that, personally, I hope his life's a living hell.